Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon for where you are. This is Bradley King from NIOSH. We're going to get started in just a couple of minutes, so please hang tight, and I look forward to starting the second day of our Spring Health and Safety Summit. So thank you. Hello, everybody. This is Bradley King at NIOSH. We're going to get started in just 1 minute. Thank you. All right, everybody, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for those of you who were able to attend yesterday. My name is Bradley King. I am a certified industrial hygienist with NIOSH. I'd like to give a big hello and a welcome to the second day of the 2024 Spring Health and Safety Summit, brought to you by the NORA Oil and Gas Extraction Sector Council. I wanted to thank everybody who participated yesterday, both the attendees and the presenters, and we're very excited for you to be able to join us today as well. I will be your moderator for the first session, and I will also be joined by Wes Fowler of CUD Energy Services and Jeff Atterbury of API for moderating duties for today's sessions as well. Similar to yesterday, I'd like to remind everybody that the findings and conclusions in these presentations are those of the authors and do not necessarily represent the official position of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, NIOSH, and the NORA Oil and Gas Extraction, or OGE Sector Council. Mention of any company or product does not constitute endorsement by CDC, NIOSH, or the NORA OGE Sector Council. Couple of housekeeping items to note. Similar to yesterday, all participants will be kept on mute throughout the duration of the presentation. However, if you do have a question during anybody's presentation, we would like to direct you to use the Q&A box that's in the control panel on your screen, specifically for questions. If you have comments that you want to share with other attendees or would like to bring something up regarding a technical issue, please use the chat function for that. This webinar is being recorded, and we will make videos available for those presenters who have given us permission to post those. And I'll be sending an email out after the end of the summit for where those can be found. There will also be a survey at the end of the day today. You'll be sent it, and we would ask you that you please take a minute to complete that survey. And it is by completing that survey that you will receive your certificate of attendance. We are providing live transcription for the summit. And so to turn it on, please select the live transcript button that you see at the bottom of your screen, and then select enable live transcription. If you do not want the transcript to appear on your screen, please select the live transcript button, but then select hide subtitle to remove transcription from appearing on your screen. For our first session today, we will be joined by Dr. Emily Haas from NIOSH to begin our discussions on safety culture in this session. After that, we'll hear from Justine Organ from Enbridge and Sam Menifee from API, at which point we'll be taking our first break at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time, 11:30 p.m. Mountain. So first up will be our first presentation from Dr. Emily Haas. Dr. Haas serves as the Associate Director for Science in NIOSH's Division of Safety Research, as well as the co-coordinator for NIOSH's Center for Direct Reading and Sensor Technologies. She has designed and implemented multiple safety culture interventions that have led to a substantial reduction in recordable injuries and documented changes to organizational policies and work practices, some of which she is discussing at her presentation today, which is titled Navigating Safety Culture in High Hazard Industries, Myths, Interventions, and Key Takeaways. So Emily, I'm going to go ahead. If you wanted to come on video, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, which should allow you to pick up and feel free to start your presentation.
Great. Thank you so much. Confirm you can see my screen okay.
It looks great and we can hear you just fine. Thank you.
Okay, absolutely. So thank you so much for the invitation. I'm looking forward to sharing some of the initiatives and research that we've been focusing on at NIOSH and with some of our partners around safety culture in high hazard industries. So with that, I'll go ahead and get started. I know you're in the second day of this summit, and you likely by now have a thorough understanding of safety culture. So I don't need to go in depth about definitions. The one thing I want to point out to you in this definition is the inclusion of the word system. So you've probably seen components of this definition throughout the last day. NIOSH has a safety culture climate working group, and one of the main things within that group is our argument that you should really kind of understand how your safety culture is situated within your overarching health and safety management system. So this is important because that system are kind of the inputs into the system is ultimately what impacts your safety culture over time. So what I'll be talking about today are some of those inputs that you can put within your overall safety and health system that are going to have a long-term impact on your culture. So a challenge, again, that you've probably been hearing with ascertaining a safety culture is that it's not necessarily tangible. What does your safety culture look like? And fortunately, across NIOSH, we have several use case examples around system inputs that have changed organizational policies, procedures, and practices really for the best. So for the remainder of this presentation, I'll highlight the utility of some various safety culture use cases as well as safety climate use cases around problem diagnosis, continuous improvement, organizational sustainability, and examples of interventions. So to just jump right into it with our use case one, problem identification. A pretty common fallacy is that safety culture or climate is just too hard to measure. We talked about this a little bit yesterday, and we are fortunate though to at least have some good measurements of safety climate specifically, kind of those snapshots in time, and then over time, the ability to be able to holistically assess safety culture in a kind of a more advanced and robust way. So I wanted to provide a few kind of free to use, easy to access resources to kind of get us started with how do we identify some of these problems from just that snapshot in time climate perspective. So The first example is our NIOSH Worker Wellbeing Questionnaire, if you're not familiar with it. So there are 5 domains that are measured within our worker wellbeing survey, and one of the domains does include aspects of culture and measures some components around management trust. And then another domain measures aspects of safety climate, which kind of talks about, again, management trust, proactivity, aspects of worker involvement. And this is a free to access survey on NIOSH's website. So I hyperlink to it here, but you can Google it and easily find kind of an implementation guide. So wanted to make you aware of that. NIOSH also developed a safety climate survey that targeted the mining industry in 2016, which can be easily adapted to other high hazard industries and actually has been. We actually measured aspects of organizational factors and individual factors to help predict worker performance. And I'll talk about some of those results a little bit later today with 2,800 workers. And this survey is also free to access through this report that you see here on NIOSH's website as well, which also includes instructions for how to use. And then finally, the Center for Construction Research and Training, known as CPWR, has a lot of free to access information around safety climate surveys and useful tools for implementation in the field. And you can also visit their website for information as well. So, assuming that you might initially use a survey or other type of assessment, even qualitative data collection, to kind of get a start of an understanding of what your current climate might looks like and where you might need to improve, that's an important starting point, so you can start to make visible changes to your workforce, and that's what's going to have that impact on your culture over time. So the next 3 use case examples that I have kind of illustrate this in action. So the next case is continuous improvement. And this is, kind of where a big common fallacy comes in around safety culture is just a buzzword, and management just uses that word to kind of talk the talk. And although this could be the case if your organization has a poor safety culture, the concept itself really is sincerely based on management and workers. Not only kind of saying, but then, walking the talk and really taking action. So let's look at examples of continuous improvement in action that have contributed to improved policies and procedures and practices on companies, which have impacted the overall safety culture, which has kind of impacted some down the road indicators as well. So in the NIOSH Safety Climate Survey that I just referenced a few slides ago, one of the key things that we found in that study is that employee engagement was a critical weakness identified at most of the participating sites. So in other words, employees had a really low perception of engagement, but these perceptions significantly impacted their safety performance. So a lot of the companies that we worked with used this critical result to make visible change at their operations. So in one example shown on this slide, a large company asked their employees during an annual refresher training to write down some of the biggest issues they felt were affecting the culture at their sites. They wrote these down on sticky notes. They put these notes up on the wall. They organized them together, and they kind of said, here are the things that we need to focus on. And you see some of those things on this slide on those sticky notes. And instead of the managers trying to solve all of these issues, they created employee-led committees to really tackle them. These committees were given autonomy to kind of propose and develop new programs. One of the really cool things that came out of it was the development of a bystander intervention program that they called See Something, Say Something, Do Something. And this program really encouraged workers to speak up when they saw something unsafe, or even a coworker doing something unsafe. And this program garnered so much attention, it was republished and promoted in a lot of different outlets and adopted by a lot of construction entities as well as mining entities. And so this is, one example of, engaging the workforce, making that tangible change. But I understand that it's your company might not be totally ready for something like that. It was a long process, and it's understandable to think that's a little bit daunting. But at a minimum, you can do what this company did, which is they turned the NIOSH summary of results that they received into a toolbox talk to be transparent about their weaknesses, plans for improvement, and they asked employees how they could do better. So something as simple as openly sharing information can go a long way in worker trust and subsequent engagement. And what's important here is that the company genuinely wanted to improve. They engaged workers in town halls where managers weren't present. The, kind of union officials were present. They took the notes, they brought them back to management. They published their actions in their global newsletter, so the company held themselves accountable to everyone that these were the changes that they were going to make. And then they did management safety tours in the field. And you can see on this slide that we were doing these surveys and the company was taking action in response to them for about a year. And you saw during that whole time, kind of those recordable injuries, stayed pretty consistent, but then you're sustaining some of these engagement efforts over time. And what happens? Their recordable incident rates go down. They attribute it to these changes that they made around employee engagement and management communication. So, safety culture can in many ways be a lagging, indicator, and then those kind of injuries and even further lagging indicator. So don't give up if you don't see changes right away. Be consistent with that, those changes in your practices and policies. So those are a couple examples I wanted to share around continuous improvement. And now I want to talk a little bit about organizational sustainability. A common fallacy here as it relates to culture is that safety and productivity are, or they kind of have to be at odds with one another. And a great example of how this is not the case is Paul O'Neill. When he took over as the CEO of Alcoa in 1987, he didn't talk about kind of profit margins. He focused on worker safety. And actually, within 24 hours of an injury happening, he wanted to receive a plan about how they were going to prevent that from happening again in the future. And by emphasizing safety over profit, they had a substantial drop in recordable injuries. I think it was like 1.85 to 0.125 per 100 workers. And their income actually, I think, like quadrupled or quintupled. So, safety and productivity can go hand in hand. And so kind of in the spirit of this Alcoa example, I wanted to focus a little bit on near miss programs and reporting as an aspect of your safety culture. So really quick, so we're all on the same page of what a near miss is. The National Safety Council defines it as an unplanned event that didn't result in injury, illness, or death, or property damage, but it did have the potential to do so. So a lot of you might have near miss reporting programs and reports that workers do complete. The form shown on this slide illustrates some typical components of a near miss report. So the example I have here, the company hosts their reporting form electronically. Employees can fill it out on a tablet. If they want to remain anonymous, though, there is a paper or pencil version that's available for them. And I was always really interested in kind of the impact and use of near miss reports. It takes the time of employees to do. And so, what are your managers doing with that information? And so a few years ago, we worked with some aggregates, asphalt, and cement operations to analyze some of the near miss incidents that people were submitting for patterns in that data. So I want to share a couple ways that the companies use some of what we found. So first, looking at just at one site, 36 near miss reports that occurred over a 2-week period, and taking that in tandem with their Take 5 reports, which are just those daily 5-minute huddles before your workday begins to kind of talk about things, reflect on what you're doing that day. We kind of compared those two things. And when comparing, we noticed that the topics discussed during the morning meeting and the near misses reported later that day or that week showed significant overlap. So in other words, the T5 meetings were functioning as an awareness prompt for their workers who were giving more attention to the issues discussed that morning. So that gave management a lot of, good insight in terms of how they could strategically discuss topics that morning around maybe hazards to be expected, non-routine work tasks. And so this was a simple yet effective way to use those near miss reports to enhance tailored communication with the workforce. And then if you initiate and complete these consistently, you can identify even more root cause issues of accidents and patterns to emerge. So we ended up actually analyzing, it was a couple hundred near miss reports. We had 167 reliable reports over a 3-month period for a company. And really what we found is that a lot of those really critical risks that were identified were the result of gaps in administrative controls and kind of workers not really thinking the risks were as severe as they were. And so the company kind of re-implemented and refreshed some risk tolerance messaging to all of their sites to really help workers understand and identify critical risks and follow up appropriately and take some administrative action. So, these are a couple ways that this company used their near miss reports and it was visible to employees, which made them want to participate in this process more. So, hopefully those examples illustrated the value of near miss programs in terms of this sustainability aspect, but your culture can really be a barrier to honest and consistent near miss reporting. So there are some specific practices to keep in mind to have an effective near miss program. So first, we want to engage in no fault reporting to build employee trust. And one way to do this is anonymous reporting if possible. I know it's harder for smaller organizations. And then we want to take immediate action with near misses so we can make improvements. Employees will not want to participate in this if you don't make every effort to look at the reports and show employees through visible action that you are using them and you are prioritizing some of those critical risks so they stay safe and healthy on the job. And then, really try to encourage suggestions around near miss reporting. We don't want to incentivize underreporting of things because we want to know what we need to change to make things better. And because employees are the ones who are doing this work, they probably have better solutions. And so it's been actually fun to be able to talk to employees about some of their near miss reports and things that they've identified in the field in terms of solutions. And then you'll want to monitor the impact of some of these activities over time. Again, your culture is, you're sustaining, maintaining it over time. So you have to keep engaging. And if you are improving aspects of the culture through new policies and programs, one of the things that might actually happen is you might get more reports that are submitted. And that's a positive indicator because it means workers trust your program and they trust you, and that there won't be retribution for reporting something. And hopefully the quality of your near miss reports improve as well. As you improve health and safety initiatives on site, that's going to be apparent to them that you care about the culture. I remember reviewing a near miss report where someone talked about their date with Minnie Mouse. And that was an example of someone not putting in the time and attention because they did not think that management looked at those. And they were right. So, are you looking at things consistently and making change? Because that's going to be a downstream indicator of your culture. So the last example I want to share is focusing on targeting and sustaining interventions over time. So a lot of people think that nothing can be done to change culture. And if that was right, we probably would not be having a 2-day summit dedicated to this topic. But a key point I want to emphasize is that we don't change culture by changing perceptions of the world around us. We change culture by improving workplace safety. So I want to say that one more time because you hear a lot about kind of worker perceptions, but we don't change a culture by changing perceptions. We change a culture by actually improving workplace safety. And how do we do that? It comes down to improving the safety related policies, procedures, and practices that are in place in the work environment. So those are some of the examples that I've been talking about today, how you can improve some policies, procedures, and practices. And that's where interventions come into play too, as something that is sustainable and measured over time. So I want to share one example of an intervention that was first implemented in 2019, and it's actually still active today, which is why I wanted to use this as the case example here. So in this example, a company was discussing hazards during an annual refresher training when they realized that employees were very, very concerned about the powered haulage risks that were occurring. There were a lot of increases in fatalities at their surface operations. And rather than kind of going through the standard training that was already in front of them about the hazards and risks around powered haulage, they were really flexible in time and kind of asked the employees during the training, like, okay, let's brainstorm, what are the major hazards that you have to contend with around powered haulage on the job? And as they brainstormed during the training, they really identified larger vehicles striking smaller vehicles, mobile equipment on site and seatbelt use, and using conveyors to move materials. And so after discussing, these hazards a little bit more, they started identifying corrective actions around them. And then after that, they could have just stopped there and said we had a really good discussion. But they actually took their employees, they divided them into groups and said, okay, you're in charge of this portion of the written plan, and you're in charge of this portion of the written plan, and you're going to talk about the goals. This group's going to talk about the timeline, and we're going to talk about an implementation plan for all of it. And it was really an amazing thing to be a part of. And based on the committee's discussions and some assistance from NIOSH, they did develop a plan to eliminate and manage powered haulage, accidents, injuries, and fatalities. And as written, the plan uses 4 leading indicator checklists or scorecards where they develop and they use them on the job. There's checklists for workers, managers, the site and equipment, and worker preparedness. And you can see an example of that checklist on this slide for workers. And it's really powerful to see all of these completed by the workforce. You could tell they're not just kind of like pencil whipping it. They're really taking the time to be conscious and provide feedback around certain areas that need it. And so this was implemented in 2019. And of course, implementing the plan is great, but follow up is critical to sustain a positive, change in some of these policies, procedures, and practices. So how do we know that there's been a change? How do we know there's been an impact and that culture over time? So in this case, a couple of weeks after implementing the plan and the checklist, management visited several of the sites where this was implemented to ask employees how it was working, how it was being used, if they had any questions. And just in a couple of weeks, so many changes were noted and made, and we've published examples of all of these. So if you're interested in them, just send me an email, but I provide just a couple here. So first a policy change was made around how workers communicate on site. They provided employees with hand signal cards to improve consistent communication among work crews, to minimize some of those powered haulage communication gaps that were occurring. In another example, after identifying road hazards when backing out of a scale house, management actually met with the county to receive permission to build another another entrance into the site to kind of avoid that interaction of cars on a public road with these large haul trucks. And so it was a procedural change that was made, but wow, did it have a huge impact. And then a lot of changes in practices too. Here we had a front end loader operator that identified and blocked access to 2 areas to prevent anyone from kind of entering them and being hurt. So a lot of things like this were made. So this shows that integrating programs can work. It just takes time and participation from everyone. And the great thing about this program is that it had commitment from management then, it still does today. And there was a recent powered haulage rule that was just proposed by MSHA. And everyone who's already doing this plan is already complying with that regulation. So way to be proactive for sure. So in discussing these use cases, I hope you saw some common themes. I'll quickly summarize them here. So first, safety culture is independent with its associated management system. Everything is connected. And obviously, maintaining a positive safety culture does require continuous monitoring, correction, and improvement. And then finally, to truly solve problems and to support a positive safety culture, we really have to think holistically. And this is where I want to end and acknowledge the integration of a total worker health approach when considering safety culture, because I do think it helps to tie everything together. So this is the slide I leave you with that looks a lot busier than it really is. But, through a total worker health lens, you see here NIOSH's total worker health hierarchy of control. So it outlines, using our typical hierarchy of controls, kind of outlines and prioritizes efforts to advance safety, health, and well-being. And in the use cases I discussed today, almost all of them address multiple controls in this figure. But as some examples, recall the near miss reporting program I discussed, and like all of the different hazards that were likely identified and mitigated through those 167 reports. So quality near misses can only occur, though, if you have that positive safety culture. And then there were a lot of substitution examples shared, but think about swapping out management-led workplace committees for those employee-led workplace committees to really enhance engagement on site. And then a lot of new safety programs were discussed today where people helped and initiated the redesign of many processes. And then, of course, the education and encouragement in the form of toolbox talks and follow-up and engagement opportunities, and really showing that safety is a value was a thread throughout today's conversation. And so I hope that in terms of making safety a value and showing these use cases in action, that over time we can actually reinforce safety and health as a value both on and off the job to advance our total well-being. And with that, we probably don't have time for questions, but if we do, I'll take them.
Great. Thank you, Emily. Wonderful presentation. We have a couple of questions in the Q&A. We'll take one just to get that to that. Did you notice a decrease in near misses after supervisors discussed these topics in their Take 5 meetings?
So one of the things I did not have time to talk about is one of the things identified was that near misses were occurring at kind of the same time every day. And so one of the things the company did was they instituted a 15-minute break around 10 a.m., which is when these near misses were occurring. And then there was a decrease in near misses reported kind of after that break time. So they were attributing it to more fatigue. People were kind of losing their situational awareness. So in that specific case, yes.
Awesome. Yeah, unfortunately, we do need to move on. There's another question, I think, in the Q&A box. So if you wanted to go into the Q&A box, you can answer that live. That would be great. We wanted to just say thank you very much for your participation. And, again, I'm sure NIOSH is looking for opportunities to potentially look at these types of issues. So feel free to reach out to Emily with any questions or thoughts about that, or to me. I'm certainly happy to facilitate from the oil and gas sector side as well. So thank you very much, Emily. We appreciate your time today.
Thank you.
All right. Next up, let me share my screen real quick. All right. Next up is Justine Organ. She is the manager of safety shared services and safety culture for Enbridge. Justine's career with Enbridge, previously Union Gas and Spectra Energy, spans 15 years. During her time with the company, she has held various roles within the health services, corporate EHS, and GDS business unit safety teams, leading projects and developing programs related to wellness, driver safety, training, confined space, and culture. She's currently a member of Enbridge's safety and reliability team working out of the Enbridge office in Chatham, Ontario. Justine holds a Bachelor of Science degree in psychology from Dalhousie University and is a Canadian Registered Safety Professional, CRSP. She'll be presenting Driving a Positive Safety Culture. So Justine, let me go ahead and stop sharing. Welcome. Let me stop sharing and pass it along to you. And
Perfect. Thank you so much.
You should be good to go.
Okay, let me make sure I have the right. Okay, and just confirmation that you can hear me okay and that you can see my slides.
I can hear you fine and your slides look great. Thank you so much.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And thank you for having me here today. Safety culture is near and dear to my heart. And I've been kind of living it and breathing it for the last few years at Enbridge. Also just want to say thanks to Dr. Emily for the great presentation. And I think you're going to see me reinforce some of the concepts and the comments that she made throughout her presentation. And with that, we'll move, if I can get my slide to move forward. So today, what I wanted to chat with the group about is Enbridge's safety culture journey. So to give you a bit of a glimpse into what we've done at Enbridge as far as safety culture is concerned, which will lead into a discussion about what's happening right now and kind of the current work that's on the go. And then I'll close it off by just giving you, similar to Dr. Emily's presentation, some observations that we've had as we've kind of been on this journey. So before I start with our Enbridge journey, I think it's a good place to start by just grounding ourselves in kind of the history of safety culture. And so most of you will know this, but back pre kind of 1970s, the term and the concept safety culture was not even on the map. At that point, it was all about technical hazard management. Fast forward through the 1970s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, there were some very significant incidents that took place, things like Challenger, Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island, for us at Enbridge Marshall. And what was discovered through the investigations of these incidents was, you know, a lot of these places or these companies looked really great on paper. Technically, they were managing the hazards within their workplace. But there was something else going on. And this is really where safety culture started to kind of bubble up to the surface. A lot of research, a lot of time spent trying to figure out what this thing called safety culture is. And there was a lot of literature and academic papers put out on it. Regulators, groups like the Canadian Energy Regulator and INPO, Institute for Nuclear Power Operators, both put out documents on safety culture. And then we at Enbridge in 2018 also published our own safety culture framework. And so you see this really, this shift from kind of safety culture being non-existent to being very theoretical. And where we think we need to go next and where we're working on going next is operationalizing it. And when I say operationalizing safety culture, it's making it real, simple, and easy for our employees to know what they need to do to contribute to a positive safety culture. And so one of the first things we did on our journey, we needed to define what safety culture is for us at Enbridge. And so we have a formal definition. It's on the screen right now. And so how we define safety culture is it's the sum of our shared attitudes, values, norms, beliefs, and practices with respect to safety and risk. How we talk about, think about, plan for, act, interact, make decisions regarding safety and risk. Those things reflect our safety culture. The other thing that we have learned is, or we've come to know and recognize, is that safety culture is a subset of our overall organizational culture. And so, you know, safety culture relies on people coming forward and raising issues and identifying hazards. And so you need to have good communication within your organization. So if you don't have that at an organizational level, you're not going to get it when it comes to safety. And so recognizing that this thing we call safety culture is really just a subset of our overall organizational culture. After we defined what safety culture was, what we wanted to do is say, okay, what does a great culture look like? And that's really where we started to develop our safety culture framework. As I mentioned, we published this document in 2014. And essentially, it outlines the traits, attributes, and characteristics of a positive safety culture. And so it gives us that goal to work towards. We know what we expect to see if we have a healthy safety culture. And it also gives us an opportunity to measure culture. So it's sort of acts as our barometer. We can go out there and say, are we seeing leadership commitment? And if we're not, what do we need to do to make that happen? One of the learnings that we've had when we originally rolled out the safety culture framework, we really focused on educating and bringing awareness around the framework itself, which is important because it's a really, really valuable tool that we have, but it doesn't give employees a lot of insight into what they need to do to create the culture we want to see. Culture is really the outcome, and what's displayed through the safety culture framework is the outcome we would expect to see. And so we started to realize, we need to shift our focus. We don't need to raise awareness of the traits, and we don't need to expect everyone to be able to recite what the traits and the positive attributes are of a safety culture. What we need to do is really hone in on the behaviors and actions that we need to drive to produce this result. And so there's been a little bit of a shift there in recent years. And so when I talk about safety culture being the outcome, so, we want to see leadership, ownership, resilience, and vigilance. Some of the initiatives or the communication tactics that we can use to drive that outcome are things like some of the communication tactics I'm going to talk about later in my presentation, the key culture building behaviors, but then also concepts and activities that kind of fall under that HRO and human and organizational performance umbrella. And so recognizing that those are some of the things we can tap into to drive the culture that we want to see. And so that brings us to today. What are we doing when it comes to safety culture? So this journey that we've been on has been a number of years. And we're building off of legacy activities that we already have in place. We had the safety culture framework, we established that and we put that in place. And so now we're looking to reframe it and make it practical. And so you'll see, kind of tying back to that original safety culture journey slide that I showed at the beginning of the presentation, is we have essentially gone from where we didn't talk about safety culture at Enbridge, and then we moved into this very theoretical space, identifying what safety culture is to us and what the goal is, what the positive traits, attributes, and characteristics are that we expect to see. And now we want to make it so that employees know how they contribute to a positive safety culture, and what we can do to continue to drive that. And how we're doing that is through our 20 to 24 safety culture. We call it our strategic plan. And basically, this plan outlines the areas of focus. And so 3 areas: consistent messaging, leadership awareness and engagement, and measuring and monitoring culture. And so the first focus area around consistent messaging, we spent some time back in 2021 with a consultant going around interviewing, looking at a bunch of different data that we had available through our system. And one of the recommendations that came from that work was that when they went out and they sampled employees and they asked them, what is safety culture to you, and what do you have to do? They got all of these different answers, and it wasn't consistent. And so what we wanted to do was really put focus on the key actions or behaviors that are necessary to driving the positive culture that we want to see here. And so what we did was we took our safety culture framework and said, okay, if we want to produce the outcome, leadership, ownership, vigilance, and resilience, what are those foundational behaviors that we need to communicate, reinforce, and create the environment where employees are able to act on those behaviors on a regular basis. And what we came up with was the triangle that you see on the right-hand side of your screen. These aren't new behaviors. They've been around for a long time, but we just bundled them together and communicated them out differently so that employees could know how they are contributing to a positive safety culture. And so those 5 behaviors are identify, I continually seek out and identify hazards and near misses. Act, I take immediate action to control hazards and/or alert my leader. Report, I speak up and report hazards, near misses, and events and call out when things go right. Learn, I commit to learning, sharing lessons and best practices, and driving improved safety performance and innovation. And lead, I lead by example every day. My actions, interactions, and decisions contribute to a healthy safety culture. And so we put these in place because we believe that these are foundational for every employee across Enbridge, whether you're on the front line all the way up to the C-suite. These are things that you can do, or we can do, to contribute to our positive safety culture. But then we also had to think about that second focus area, which was leadership, awareness, and engagement, because leadership plays a critical role in creating and sustaining culture. And so we said, it's all great to tell our employees that we expect them to identify, act, report, learn, and lead, but there's an entire environment that they operate within, and there needs to be specific things put in place that empower them and allow them to demonstrate these behaviors and action on them. And that's where we talk to leadership. And so you'll see the triangle with a leadership triangle around it, because leaders create the space and the environment for their teams to be able to execute on those key culture building behaviors. And so throughout 2023, we sat down with every leader across Enbridge. So we ran about 90 workshops. About 1,200 leaders went through it. And what we focused on talking to leadership about was the key things that they can do as leaders to create the space where their employees can demonstrate these key culture building behaviors. And so these are more of the soft skills, and this is where you definitely see the overlap with our organizational culture, and these leadership behaviors are crucial to that kind of overarching organizational culture. So we talked about them being present and engaging with their employees and how to talk to them about safety, scanning for weak safety signals, embracing the red. And so a lot of the time, we spend a lot of time talking about, how easily does the truth get all the way up the organization? Because when we're talking about safety, we need to be able to highlight issues and concerns, and we need to raise them all the way up the chain so that we get the support to address them and take care of them from a safety perspective. And then the last behavior was bias for action. And so making sure that leadership is, if they have an employee come forward with a safety concern or a hazard that's brought forward, do they take the steps they need to address that as soon as it comes forward? Or do they engage the appropriate people to make sure that there's action taken? The other thing we spent time talking to leadership about, and this ties very much to Dr. Emily's conversation prior to my presentation, is the interdependency between our management system and our safety culture. And basically, these two things work together in a synergistic way to produce that superior performance that we're driving for. And a great example that came up through the workshop conversations that we've had were around our procedures and our policies, and areas where we might have complexities, and if they get raised but they don't get addressed, that really drives frustration within the organization, and that frustration can lead to disengagement and lowering of our safety culture. And so you see this kind of interconnectivity between the management system and the safety culture. And so we talked to the leadership about their role in not only the safety culture, but how they ensure that employees are set up to meet the management system requirements and execute on them the way that we would expect. And so in that sense, we say that safety culture, and this is actually taken from James Reason, we just reiterate it and reinforce it constantly within Enbridge, but we say safety culture is the engine that drives our management system towards the goal of effectively and sustainably managing safety hazards and risks. The third focus area within our 2022 to 2024 strategic plan revolves around measuring and monitoring the health of our safety culture. And historically, Enbridge has relied on the previously INGA-SEPA, now INGA-API Safety Culture Perception Survey, survey that is undertaken every 3 years. And so I'm going to talk about some of the results we've seen through that survey and some of the improvements that we've seen. But when we sat down to talk about measuring and monitoring culture, we talked about the need, again, as Dr. Emily talked about, the need to continuously measure and monitor culture so that we can take action as soon as something starts popping up. And a lot of the times we say, you know, with the perception surveys, it's an opportunity to dig deeper and ask more questions and get out with employees and talk to them about what's going on. So then we can really put some positive actions in place that are going to make a real change. And so some of the tactics that we've taken on to measure and monitor culture on a more frequent basis, we've teamed up with our HR group. So HR does an engagement survey, usually kind of on the off cycle of our INGA API survey. And so how can we leverage engagement survey data to inform how our safety culture is performing? We've also introduced monthly pulse checks. So they're quick online surveys that employees can do through their mobile device, usually one question, and we've tailored those questions to focus in on areas where we had deficiencies that came through our INGA API result. And so those are like quick snippets that we can get on a monthly basis to see how things are going. We've also started to send out targeted surveys. So we talked about, you know, where do employees feel our safety culture or experience our safety culture? And so what we did was we started to send targeted surveys to those employees who have gone through incident investigations, who have made safety suggestions, or have submitted near-miss incidents, so that we can see what their experience was like going through those key activities where we would expect to see our safety culture really come out. And then the final thing that we're doing is looking at what sort of management system data we have that can be tied to the health of our safety culture as well, and trying to tie that all together to give us a really robust picture of where our safety culture is at and how healthy it is. I will say that this kind of more robust structure of measuring and monitoring culture, we've just we initiated it at the beginning of 2023. So we're very much in the infancy of this whole thing, but are seeing some really big benefits to doing it on a regular basis and being informed on kind of where things are at across the board. So as I mentioned, we participate in the INGA API survey, and I know Sam's on after me to talk about the survey. And so I believe this is our third time going through the survey. And so we do that as a part of the industry grouping that goes through it. But we take a little bit of a different approach when we receive the results. And so similar to INGA API, mapping the safety culture survey questions to the elements the elements of the pipeline safety management system. We map the questions to our safety culture framework. And so we are able then to get a score based off the survey responses on how we're performing based on our different traits and attributes identified within our safety culture framework. So it gives us this consistent language to use to speak about safety culture at Enbridge. And it gives us an idea of how we're performing in each of those areas, which then leads us to be able to see where we need to put an effort in and where we might need to take action. And so over time, as I mentioned, we've participated in the INGA survey the last 3 times they've run it, so 2016, 2019, 2024. And we've seen improvements. And I would say those improvements are a result of us being able to see where we're at and then design action plans to address the deficiencies that we're seeing. And so, for example, in our 2019 survey, we score generally pretty good on all of the questions, but one area that we scored lower on was regarding management of change and employee safety recognition. And so as a follow-up in 2021 and 2022, we put some actions in place to raise awareness, to build understanding around the management of change, and to make some improvements on the employee safety recognition side. And so when we went through the survey in 2023, we were able to see improvements in both of those areas, as well as over a number of other attributes within our safety culture framework. So it's really nice to be able to have those scores, put actions in that are really targeted at the deficiencies or the areas of opportunity that you have, and then be able to circle back to see how those action plans, whether they worked, whether you need to still keep working. So it's really nice to be able to have that kind of consistent way to measure, take action, and remeasure. And so I'll just close out my presentation. And I've kind of spoke to all of these already, but just to highlight some of the observations or the learnings that we've had as we've been on this safety culture journey. And so the first is that safety culture is a subset of our overarching organizational culture. And so it's very highly influenced by the organizational culture as a whole. Safety culture is an outcome. So, you know, rather than what we did when we first rolled out the safety culture framework and just educating and raising awareness to our employees on what safety culture is, we really need to start to shift our focus and talk about what we need employees to do and set things up. So as Dr. Emily said, you know, you don't change the culture by changing perceptions, you change the culture by improving safety. So what changes can we make to our policies, procedures, our management system that increases engagement and really encourages employees to participate in the whole system? Leaders play a critical role in creating and sustaining culture. And so we recognize that that is an area that you can never let up. You need to maintain the focus on leadership and giving them the resources and tools that they need to create the environment that will build the culture that we want to have. And then finally, the journey is never ending. There is always stuff to do. And by measuring and monitoring, you're able to keep track of where you're currently at, and then you can pivot and make changes and take action where you need to. And so that is what we've learned at Enbridge, and that is our safety culture journey.
Hi, Justine. That is great presentation. I loved your lessons learned, you know, there at the ending, and learning how you've been measuring and monitoring these changes over the course of the past several years. I think, you know, being able to show those with those types of measurable goals really speaks to seeing progress, which I love to see. We did have one question that came through in our Q&A box. So Tom Canode made a comment, great work on making safety culture actionable within Enbridge. So kudos to you for that. The question was, within the culture building behaviors, identify, learn, act, etc., do you also assess organizational trust and response to ensure reporting and communications aren't suppressed by leadership attitude and response?
Yeah, so great question and extremely important. And so I would say through the culture building behaviors, they're more of a communication tactic that we can use to really focus employees in what they need to do. But through some of the measuring and monitoring activities that we are doing, we are really trying to drill down to that trust. We talk a lot about building psychological safety. So creating the space where people feel okay to admit errors, to bring problems forward. And so I would say not necessarily, I mean, we talk about the key culture building behaviors so employees know what to do, but it's more on the leadership side where we talk about those things are important to getting employees to identify, act, report, learn, and lead and bring things forward. And then the measuring and monitoring tools are kind of where what we're using to assess whether it's actually happening or not, or if we have any issues.
Perfect. Sounds good.
Yeah.
You know, it sounds like your journey, you know, is mature in many ways. For those companies that maybe are just starting on this journey, do you have, specific, quick recommendations for what you've learned from someone who may be feeling overwhelmed with beginning at looking at this, from your robust programs that you've developed? Do you have any just last words of wisdom for folks in that type of situation?
Yeah, I do. So the safety culture framework that we developed, I love that tool. It is extremely valuable for me in trying to help the organization grow the culture. But the one thing that I would say is that when we originally established that, we spent a lot of time educating and raising awareness on each of the components of that safety culture framework, which really confused some people. Like, it left employees saying, okay, this is great information. Like, I kind of understand it, but what the heck do I do with it? And so I would say that having that document developed and established is really important for the people who are trying to drive the change. But then to the front facing, like what you show the employees, it's more focusing them in on the specific things that you want them to do that will drive that outcome. So that, I would say that's my biggest learning.
Awesome. Sounds
Yeah.
good. Thank you. We had a couple of additional comments come through, just thanking you for that information and for your presentation. And so if you wouldn't mind stopping sharing your screen. Great. Thank you. And so what I'm sharing is Justine's email. Feel free to shoot her any emails if you have additional questions after that. But we're going to move to our next speaker. So thank you very much, Justine. We appreciate your time today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. All right. Next up is Sam Menifee. Sam is a senior policy advisor in the midstream department at the American Petroleum Institute, API. Sam has been with API for 9 years and focuses on pipeline safety management systems, safety culture, pipeline public engagement and awareness, damage prevention, and workforce development issues. Sam received his BA from George Washington University, a master's in public policy from American University, and resides in Washington, D.C. He'll be presenting the importance of safety culture for pipeline operators. So, Sam, I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Perfect.
Okay, so you should be able to share at this point.
Great. And let me do a sound check. Can you hear me okay, Bradley?
I can hear you. I can hear you fine. The version of the slides that you're showing is not. Yeah, there you go.
Perfect. Can you see them
Well,
okay now?
We can see them, but we're actually seeing, not seeing the full slide deck. We're seeing your notes part. There you go. Perfect.
Yeah.
Looks great.
Great.
Thank you,
Great.
sir.
Well, thank you, Bradley, and all the team at NORA for the opportunity to speak with you all today, and wanted to commend Dr. Emily and Justine as well for their presentations. Certainly 2 tough acts to follow on my end. But as Bradley mentioned, my name is Sam Menifee. I'm a senior policy advisor at API in our midstream space, and Bradley mentioned all the interesting and fun items I work on within the midstream space here at API. But I wanted to touch on safety culture, as I know many of you have already today, and we've gone over a number of definitions. So I'm not going to rattle through another definition of what we consider safety culture to be. But basically the perceptions of the policies, procedures, strength of an organization's commitment to safety, and basically how leaders respond to safety violations and ideas for improving safety. And that's great to have that definition, but a lot of people usually ask me, well, what are the benefits and what does safety culture actually impact? And through our research and through our work with academic partners, we've actually found safety culture can predict a company's accident or injury rates. And it's a very powerful predictive analytical tool. And it can also, having a robust safety culture can increase the number of reported errors and near misses and create opportunities to prevent reoccurrence from happening in the future. It's also a critical part of a safety management system. And Justine mentioned API recommended practice 1173. It's our handy dandy recommended practice on safety management systems and pipeline SMS, created in 2015 by API and published following a number of high profile transmission incidents. But 1173 states fairly explicitly that you cannot have a strong safety management system without a robust safety culture. And the two work hand in hand. And a strong safety culture certainly connects and is indicative as to how your safety management system is functioning. And lastly, it can determine if your policies around incident investigation, evaluation, lessons learned are really effective. And going back to that second bullet, if they're preventing similar incidents from recurrence. So a little bit on our journey. The addition of 1173 came out in 2015, but safety culture was recognized as a critical impact, a critical component of safety and high performance within transmission operators, dating all the way back to 2013 and probably far beyond that. But starting in 2013, the transmission operators on the gas side through INGA started doing a 3-year cycle of safety culture surveys. 2013, 16, and 19, INGA members did safety culture surveys. And then in 2020, API and AOPL, the Association of Oil Pipelines, now LIPA, joined together and we started our safety culture journey as well. We did our benchmark in 2020 with 8 operators. It was happening right in the middle of COVID with the market downturn. And so a little bit smaller on the participation side than we would have liked, but still a great benchmark for us to establish in 2020. And then we did our survey with API and LIPA and joined up with the INGA members in 2023 to have about 22 companies participate in 2023 and about 35,000 employees. And so you can see this decades-long journey that we are on. And we've surveyed, including the INGA members, API, LIPA members, almost 100,000 employees in the pipeline industry. And we're now on a really, I think, a very effective and good cadence every 3 years, with 1 year being the transmission operators, another year being the contractors through the INGA Foundation and the SEPA Foundation. That would be to both distribution and transmission contractors. And then the other year through utilities and distribution contractors. And then again, third year, we return back to that transmission cycle. So we're really embodying that plan, do, check, act cycle of continuous improvement that is a critical component of 1173. And we're hitting every segment of the pipeline industry. We're not singling out transmission and having transmission start and having distribution do a totally different thing, and contractors are off on their own doing something completely different. We recognize that the public often doesn't differentiate between a transmission pipeline, a gathering pipeline, a distribution pipeline. To them and to most people, a pipeline is a pipeline, and it could be carrying gas, refined product, NGLs, crude. It really doesn't matter. But one incident looks badly on the entire industry. And so joining together and creating this united front to improve safety culture, to improve safety performance, we believe is a step in the right direction. And so coming out of our 2020 survey, there were a number of pertinent learnings that came up. The first being that focus on safety at the work group level is very strong. There's certainly a sentiment within employees that everything that we do is safe, but that feeling weakens a little bit as you get up the chain. And there's certainly an opportunity to improve safety culture and what senior leaders do. And that learning ties very closely with the second one, which is the more that senior leaders commit to and demonstrably show their commitments to public safety externally, and that could be through community engagements, public partnerships, building trust, long-term relationships, that increases the awareness of pipeline safety management systems, and it drives commitment to SMS and overall safety culture index scores. So having those senior leadership commitments and actions, really, it's not just the commitment, it's the demonstrable action that goes along with it. Having those actions take place and having them, the awareness of those actions trickle down to field level employees that has significant and profound impacts. It helps employees connect to SMS. It helps them connect to safety culture, and it drives awareness, drives these scores, drives better scores throughout the survey. The last one goes to what many of you have talked about already today, but paying attention and achieving safety targets for those who speak up about safety on their jobs. And there is certainly an opportunity to provide a little bit greater recognition, less punitive and more beneficial actions for those who speak up about safety on their jobs. When we look at the 2023 Safety Culture Survey, again, we had 8 operators and about 7,500 employees surveyed in 2020 with our baseline. 2023, we had 22 operators participate. Again, API, LIPA, INGA members, but also a number of Canadian operators who are not members of those associations. We surveyed over 38,000 employees and received about 31,000 respondents, so over 80% response rate, which is fantastic. Again, the survey is 84 questions, and that may seem overwhelming. It may seem like a lot, but actually the average completion time was under 14 minutes. So it certainly wasn't burdensome for people to take the survey. It was conducted over email, although one company used paper, and they do have that option. Any participant has that option moving forward to use paper. Email is a little bit easier, a little bit more cost effective, but certainly some field employees are more familiar and more readily will take a survey on paper, and we're more than happy to work with those as well. The survey ran from September 6th to October 13th, closed on the 13th. Again, over 80% response rate, which is fantastic, among over 31,000 employees across the 22 companies. When we look at our organizational structure, I think this is something that lends a ton of credibility to the survey. You obviously have the associations on the right-hand side through INGA, API, LIPA, but we have a strong technical lead through PPIC, Process Performance Improvement Consultants, who have a history and who have a strong partnership with academic partners. And so we work with the research lead at Texas A&M University. We've worked with academics at University of Houston as well to provide the research and a lot of the underlying research and credibility that helps drive some of our results. Email administration, we talked about this a little bit as well. Unique links are sent to each employee. So we create an employee hierarchy file, build it all the way up from the bottom employee all the way up to the top. It can add in demographics depending on what the participant is looking for, age, tenure at the company, certainly really good items to include there. 84 items, we'll talk about those items again in a second. And then employees can rate the items on a Likert scale. So all the way from strongly disagree, neutral, agree, strongly agree. And it's offered in English and Spanish. Obviously want to provide the survey in the most familiar language for employees and one that they can answer without having to do a translation, ton of legwork, anything like that. On the right-hand side of the screen, you can see the welcome email that went out. That was the kind of the first email with the actual survey itself that was sent out to employees. We did a lot of pre-communications and kind of messaging before the survey was fielded itself, and then that email on the right-hand side was the one that actually released the survey itself. Couple items, survey questions itself that we had. These are just 3 of the 84, but on the left-hand side, you can see the survey item itself. That middle row is the SMS category that it lines up to. So each of the 84 questions will map to one pipeline SMS program element. The first edition of 1173 has 10 program elements that are in it, and the 84 questions map one-to-one to one SMS category. So it helps operators assess not only their safety culture, but also their SMS implementation. Are we deficient on leadership commitment because we're seeing scores that are lower on all questions that are tagged with SMS? And then we also took it a step further and we included a number of psychological dimensions. And this is in particular where we relied on our academic partner. Texas A&M had mapped a number of psychological dimensions to be able to show what are some drivers of safety priority, what are some drivers of effective procedures, really worker attitudes, psychological safety, so that we can not only have our SMS program category, but we can also look at some of these psychological dimensions as well. When we list out all of these dimensions, they're up on the screen, a little bit overwhelming at first, but they are grouped according to color code. So you can see some on safety culture, looking at safety priority. Within leadership actions, we included hazards, asset or process safety, resource, procedure accountability, training, coaching, recognition, and then some of those softer skills, accountability, delegation, caring. We looked at worker behavior and feelings with compliance, safety, citizenship, empowerment, and psychological safety. And lastly, we looked at events and outcomes. That bottom one, overall safety index rating, was kind of a compendium of all the prior ones. But we also looked at near misses, injuries, and incidents as well. So those those psychological dimensions came out of our partnership with Texas A&M, and were a little bit of a new facet with the 2023 cycle, and something we're looking to continue moving forward. This chart maps out a little bit of the questionnaire structure. It might be a little overwhelming at first, but it maps out where the actual survey items, the 84 survey items, fall. And I think this safety culture survey is very unique in that it kind of bifurcates the survey into three main groups. It asks questions of employees about their senior leadership, their direct supervisor, and their work group. So you can tell on a kind of multi-level facet how safety culture is viewed within the organization. Going back to our 2020 lesson, or 2020 lessons learned, safety sentiments within the work group were very strong. But we found as you went up that employee chain to direct supervisor, senior leadership, it was weakened a little bit. And so having those demonstrable commitments and actions from senior leadership and from supervisors will drive those work group perceptions up the chain. Moving to the right, you see the dimension structure. So our 10 pipeline SMS program elements that each of the 84 questions map to. The psychological safety dimensions we just talked about in the previous slide, safety index, which is a compendium of those scores. Pipeline SMS favorability and familiarity were two questions that we asked. So we asked employees what their familiarity with pipeline safety management systems was, and their kind of connection or their role to it. And then you can see the three different levels of employees. On the far right are all the different norms and the comparisons that a participant in this survey could compare with. Certainly you have the operator's own individual score. You would then have a norm of all the INGA members. So we would compile all the INGA members, create a benchmark for the INGA members, and then an operator could compare their scores to that norm. You would also have a norm for all API LIPA members, so all liquid transmission operators. The hierarchy groups, getting back to the work group levels, historical trends. So if you participated in 2020, or if you're an INGA member dating back and you participated every 3 years since 2013, you can map your scores across that journey to be able to see, okay, are we improving in some areas or declining, deteriorating in some others, and what might those mitigations be? You can also look at high or low favorability and drivers, which we'll talk to in a second. The portal where the results are housed is all through a company called Perceptix. We've worked with Perceptix and their predecessor, Culture IQ, for a number of years. But this dashboard allows operators to go in real time and check out their scores. You can check out response rates, the favorability scores on the bottom for any of the different questions. And then, as this slide illustrates, you can slice it, dice it based on any of the demographic views. So if you provided information on your employee's tenure, so less than 1 year at the company all the way to over 20 years at the company, that's something you could compare. You could compare work groups. So any work group that has submitted at least 5 responses, you'll be able to compare this work group to that group. And again, the 5 responses to keep this anonymous and confidential as well. So if you don't have 5 responses, you only, let's say, have 2 responses in your work group, that would get rolled up to the next level, to the next work group that had at least 5, and you'd be able to compare that on a one-to-one basis. Ethnicity is something you can compare as well. Gender, role within the company, so comparing people by their roles. Certainly all this demographic information is able to be sliced and diced by the operator depending on what they're looking for. We talked about some of the lessons learned from 2020. We're now in the process of identifying some of those lessons learned and some of the actions that came out of the 2023 cycle. So there were 3 questions that we felt really had some outsized impact at the top of the screen. And those are, the first one is companies that have adequate mechanisms in place to allow for public community inquiries and feedback. That relates to the external engagement or stakeholder engagement within 1173. The next one was dating and relating to leadership commitment, but making sure that a company has and quickly corrects hazards, even if it's costly. So valuing safety over timeliness, costliness, or budget. And then related to operational controls, using systems to track and ensure that maintenance is in compliance, not just that maintenance is being done, but using a systematic approach to track those projects. So we saw those 3 as driving a little bit of outsized impact than some of their other counterparts within the survey. And they relate really to the priorities and the lessons learned that we see coming out of this. A focus on PSMS familiarity and engagement, and not just the fact that there is an 1173 document out there. I think that is easy for field staff to dismiss, frankly, as a kind of an executive initiative of the day, flavor of the day, and tomorrow will be something else, and the day after that will be something else. But if you focus on what that employee's connection is to PSMS, what their connection is to safety culture, we found that drives the scores exponentially. And the second bullet there under the priorities is a plug for API recommended practice 1185. So one of the other roles that I have here at API is working on public engagement. And public engagement, external engagement was one of the it was the lowest score within the safety culture survey. So RP 1185 creates a framework for how operators can engage with the public, identify stakeholders, build relationships over the life cycle of a pipeline. There's an upstream counterpart, which is very, very similar to 1185 that was released last week as entitled Recommended Practice 100-3. It's a second edition of that. Both documents are very similar in how they create a framework and create guidance for operators to engage the public. A little bit of a paradigm shift from the way pipeline operators have done things historically, which is we're buried underground, we're going to go unseen, we'll comply with public awareness requirements, but public engagement might be something we do only when we're really needed to do it. This is changing a little bit in setting up those long-term relationships, and particularly creating mechanisms for public feedback to quickly correct hazards and use systems to ensure maintenance is in compliance. But that 1185 compliance and working towards 1185 will really demonstrate some of the gaps that we have in external engagement. And once we identify, prioritize, and start closing those gaps, we hope increasing some of those scores in external engagement. Gets back really to the lesson learned that came out of 2020, and that senior leadership's demonstrable actions towards public safety and particularly external engagement really drive not only the external engagement scores within a safety culture, but the overall safety index and even pipeline SMS awareness and familiarity. And that was a really interesting learning for me, in that public engagement and leadership's commitment to engagement doesn't just impact engagement, but it has profound impacts on the safety index and on SMS awareness, familiarity moving forward. We talked a lot about how we measure and assess safety culture. And as a trade association, we don't offer a ton of guidance on how you actually implement a safety culture or a robust safety culture. We can set up the guidelines for measuring, assessing it. And I think trade associations can play a really good role in creating forums to exchange information on implementing a strong safety culture. But one of the things we did do to this end is we held a workshop in Houston in March of this year, where we had a number of operators walk through leading practices. and they were leading practices on action planning, so how they use the results internally to close gaps, to include some of the results in performance reviews for managers. We talked about internal engagement, how you drive participation in the survey, external engagement. We've talked about that a lot today. But really, it was that forum for open exchange for leading practices for pipeline operators. So a number of operators that participated in the survey were there and participated, but we also had contractors who are going to participate in this survey this year, 2024, likely in the June, July timeframe, to learn from their operator peers and set up and get ready for their own safety culture survey. Again, contractors did the survey back in 2021. So now this is their 3-year cycle to start again, and then they'll start preparing in short order, I'm sure, for the 2027 survey, which will be upon us in no time. And so it was very interesting to hear their journeys, their comparisons with past scores, and kind of how they were setting up for the future. We've also continued to do in-depth analysis with individual operators and safety culture teams. So we have our consultant through PPIC, and we also have a chief analytical officer through Perceptics, who lives and breathes safety culture data and does this stuff every day. And the two of them will sit down with an operator and walk through their scores, figure out where some of the gaps are and some of the actions that an operator may use to close some of those gaps, and really help participants get their heads around what may be a lot of data. Certainly 84 questions, 10 program elements, 16 psychological dimensions, all the demographics that can be sliced and diced. There's a lot of information that goes into these surveys. And so these kind of in-depth analysis help make sense of that information and help the operator figure out what they're going to do short, medium, and long term. And the last slide here is on the deliverables. We started talking about the connection between safety culture and pipeline SMS, and it's really around that plan, do, check, act cycle of continuous improvement. And so the survey itself reflects that cycle. We do the surveys, we plan for the surveys, we do the surveys itself, we check the scores, we do action planning on the act side, we figure out what the gaps are, we prioritize them, and then 3 years later or 3 years after the initial survey, we do the survey all over again and figure out where those gaps are, if we've moved closer towards closing them at all, and what that journey looks like moving forward. So the action planning, I think, there reflects that PDCA cycle that's in 1173, and operators can develop these interventions on improving the organization, both for that individual cycle as well as additional cycles moving forward and more remeasurement moving forward. So we talked a little bit about the transmission cycle that we've expanded. We are including distribution contractors now on our SMS journey. Really excited about the work that's gone into this. Excited not only on our 2020, 2023 cycle, but to support our partners on the contractor side this year, distribution next year, and then get ready for all the fun to start with the transmission operators in 2026. So there's my contact information. We also have a website on Pipeline SMS. It's pipeline-sms.org. We will shortly have a website on pipeline public engagement, but please feel free to reach out to me. I know I'm a midstream person, but more than happy to connect up with my my upstream counterpart and support any upstream journeys along safety culture.
Great. Thank you, Sam. Really great presentation. Yeah, no, you were kind of alluding to something that, you know, a lot of this, at least from my understanding from your presentation, is geared towards, you know, the midstream pipeline distribution side of things. Is there a similar effort at all underway at API or other partnering organizations on the upstream side as well to collect this type of survey data? If not, can that be done? I'm just curious kind of behind what are the logistics behind this type of a survey? Do you know, is it funded by API or INGA? You know, is like what would it take to expand something like that to the upstream side?
Absolutely. And I know Jeff is on the call as well. And so I may speak a little bit and then see what gaps or where I have spoken incorrectly for Jeff to correct me. I think upstream operators are looking at this effort and they're trying to figure out where to start, which is a logical first step. And I think it's bifurcated a little bit between offshore and onshore operators, and they're trying to determine what those next steps will be. In terms of the logistics, the trades and API in particular play kind of a little bit of a middleman repository role. We don't fund the survey. The survey is funded by operators themselves. So an operator that wants to participate pays the survey consultant directly. API really serves as a little bit of a clearinghouse. We help organize the vendor, the consultant. We do all kinds of master service agreements, non-disclosure agreements to ensure that all the data is protected and confidential. But API doesn't view any individual company's specific results. I will never see what company A's results is versus company B. I will only see top-level aggregated results throughout the industry. So I think there's absolutely the possibility that upstream operators could conduct a similar thing. And you asked, or someone asked, Justine, where do you start? If you're a smaller company, or if you've just started on the journey, or if you've sprung out of a merger and acquisition, where do you start? And I think just taking this first step and doing a survey like this, even if you know that there's room for improvement, work to be done, taking this first step starts the journey, and it's a quantifiable way for you to say, here's where I am and here's where I want to go, and what are those steps needed to get there.
Yeah, great. Jeff, did you have a comment that you wanted to make about upstream or not?
No, I mean, I think Sam pretty much nailed it pretty well. Upstream, we're a little less mature on the safety front, especially on the onshore side. We founded the OSA, the Onshore Safety Alliance, 3 years ago. Safety culture is a core component on that, and we are revamping our strategy on safety culture. So within this year, we'll be putting out a new plan of action, at least on the onshore side. And I know the Center for Offshore COS is also eagerly working this issue as well. So we're just a little less mature, but it is certainly an issue that's on our table.
Great. Thank you, sir. I have one question. We only have about a minute before we'll need to head to break, but I think you might be able to answer this. One of the biggest gaps, this is a question from Tom. One of the biggest gaps and challenges I've seen over the last 20 years on culture surveys is development and acting on performance improvement plans. Do you have a couple of examples of good actions that made a difference?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would point towards one, the senior leaders' demonstrable actions towards public safety and external engagement. We found back in 2020, and we found it a little bit not maybe as acute in 2023, but those, getting out in the community, meeting with community partners, sponsoring a high school, whatever it may be, those actions had a really profound impact, not only in the engagement scores, but on all the others as well. Between that and helping employees connect to their specific role on SMS, those I think were two of the biggest. And it's not showing them 1173 and saying our company is doing 1173. It's, you're a field technician, here's what 1173 means to you as a field technician, or as a, you fill in the blank there. Those two, I think, if you took all the other corrective actions, action planning out, if you just relied and just focused on those two, you would still see some pretty profound improvements.
Awesome. Sounds good. Thank you, Sam, so much for all of this information and for your presentation today. It was really informative. So thank you, sir. If you don't mind stopping to share your screen, I'll restart sharing mine. All right, everybody. So this is our first break. We will be back in about 15 minutes at 1:45 p.m. Eastern Time, 11:45 Mountain Time to begin our next set of presentations. Again, thanks to all of our partners who helped to advertise our summit. And we look forward to being back in about 15 minutes. Thank you.
Hello and welcome back to the second session of today's meeting. My name is Wes Fowler. I am with Cud Energy Services and Spinnaker Cementing Solutions, and I will be moderating your next session. Today, we're going to hear from Dr. David Rentz of Slippery Rock University, followed by Dr. Jerry Eubank of Oxy, and we'll follow those two presentations with our next break at 2:45 p.m. Eastern Time. David, I will stop sharing if you want to go ahead and get yours screen up. So our next speaker is Dr. David Rentz. He is an associate professor of safety management at Slippery Rock University, located north of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Prior to teaching, Dr. Rentz has over 30 years of HSE experience in industry, including Mobile Chemical, Honeywell, and Armstrong in community care and counseling with traumatology specialization. Dr. Eubank is currently exploring measures to prevent the development of PTSD in the nursing profession for those subjected to chronic exposure to direct and indirect trauma. Thank you for joining us today, Jerry. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'll let you put yours up.
Thank you very much for having me.
Absolutely. Your audio is good, and I've got your presentation.
Okay, you should be able to see my screen now.
Yes, sir, we've got it.
Okay. So again, welcome everybody. It's been some great presentations for the last 2 days. And what I hope to do is to bring all of this kind of together in a way, because I've had the opportunity, if I can get my tech to work here. I've had the opportunity to work on 5 continents, 22 countries, primarily in the oil and gas industry. And I've seen what, all of this with culture and the workforce and trying to get everybody to work cohesively. I see the advantages and disadvantages of that. Also, with that being said, a lot of the other presenters had talked about culture, cultural awareness. We just spoke about authority, authoritarian positions on location. So you'll see how all of this is influenced by the individual's culture. And again, I can't advance. Here we go. So now, as far as the cultural input, you've got all of these different continents around the world that are producing oil and gas. So the darker the color is in that picture, the more oil and gas potential they have to produce. So of course, that means that you've got all of these local workers. Some of them have never worked in the oil field before. It's a new technology. It's new for their environment, for their communities. So contractually, a lot of times the governments control the oil rights. So it's written in a contract that you will have to have so many local employees working on a rig. You also have expats that come in. So as these expats come in and you're developing within those communities, you're going to have people that work in the field. You're going to have people that are technical providers. You're going to have members of management, and then also the C-suite or the corporate. And then you're going to have your host countries, which have the expatriates, which are coming in from different countries that have specific specializations and special knowledge. And then, of course, again, the local labor. So now you're taking this safety culture. You've heard safety culture for the last 2 days. So I'm not going to define safety culture again, quasi like everybody else did, because there's, as they said, there's a lot of different definitions for safety culture. So I'll just talk about culture, culture in general. It's a set of learned behaviors and beliefs that characterize a society or people group. Actions and interactions create a culture at work. So it's all based on their values, beliefs, language, communication, and material objectives. So that establishes what your cultural brand is. So you've got all of these people that are coming together with all of these different cultures to perform work on a common job site. And I don't care if it's upstream, midstream, downstream. Um, they're all coming together, mixing all of these cultures. And you'll see how this can be challenging and how it can have some adverse safety implications. So as far as a national culture, you're talking about a corporate culture, which may be in the US, and a national culture, which may be in Nigeria or Japan, Singapore, South Korea, and they're extremely different. So now there's 8 different scales that you can weigh what those different cultures are. One of them is in communication. So you've got low context versus high context. And in doing that, you've got high context languages, which let's say Japanese is a high context language, and there's only 70,000 words roughly thereabouts within the Japanese language. Then you take English. So in the English language, there's roughly 500,000 words in the English language. So now you're trying to translate or get across to somebody what it is you mean using your 500,000 words, and they may have English as a second language, and they haven't learned all 500,000 words. I haven't learned all 500,000 words. So sometimes, even speaking English as a primary language, you need to go back and reaffirm what it is they're talking about. So now you do that reflective listening thing, because if you don't, culturally, you have a limiter. So now you've got the corporate safety culture. So as we talk about corporate safety cultures, you've got 4 different types of corporate safety cultures. One is forced. So with the forced, you're requiring people to perform acts of safety. You're giving them safety incentives to perform safe work. You're requiring them to write so many BBS observations a day. They're not doing it because they want to do it. They're doing it because you're making them do it. Then you've got the protective, and I'm very familiar with organizations that have the protective safety culture, to where every time something goes wrong, they don't go out and retrain the people or train the people further. They actually come up with a policy, standard, procedure, or guideline. You know, they're going to write their way out of it. And that doesn't help. It may provide some guidance, but you haven't actually changed the culture and you haven't changed the behavior. And then you have the involved safety culture, to where management gets involved. They do attend some of the safety training, but you don't have senior management actually attending and supporting. And then whenever you get into the integral, your safety department, they've actually got a budget, they've actually got some authority. And I don't mean authority to where they run people off and things of that nature, because I think safety people running people off is detrimental. It's detrimental to the organization. It's detrimental to the operation. But it does provide an opportunity for you to train people. So if you have the authority to actually establish a training program and implement that training and get people trained up, if you will, then you'll have a really good integral safety culture. And then safety management also comes to those meetings. And I'm not talking about if you have a confined space training program that they come and get trained in confined space. If somebody from the C-suite just shows up and shows interest in everybody participating, and maybe has a 5-minute conversation, you know, showing their interest and their acceptance of everybody coming in, that goes a long way in building that culture. Now you've got a dominant safety culture, to where it's the culture that it may not be the culture on location, but it's the dominant culture within the region. Here in the US, you have Anglo or Anglo-Saxon, which is going to be primarily white Western. Then you've got the Western culture, which anywhere else in the world. They consider the U.S. as being Westerners. It's directed by affluent or people with money, and it's very capitalistic. I hate to say it, but that get her done mentality is pretty prevalent here in the U.S., especially in the oil and gas industry. And then it's success oriented. It's not based on failures or try agains. It's very success oriented, and also it's male dominant. Talking about the male gender. So then you're looking here on the chart on the right, and you'll see all of the different colors of the chart, and that's all of the different ethnicities that go into making up not dominant cultures, but popular cultures within the regions. So now, as far as more on the eight scales that you can go by, you start looking at evaluating. So then you've got different cultures that evaluate different ways. Again, oil and gas is an international organization or an international industry. So you start looking at evaluating, and you have direct negative feedback and indirect negative feedback. Depending on where you're at in the world, some of that feedback may be frank, blunt, and extremely honest versus being soft, subtle, and diplomatic. If you were Russia, working in Russia, you would see that frank, blunt, and honest feedback compared to Japan, where it would be more soft, subtle, and diplomatic. And you're looking at this on a linear scale to where the extreme harsh would be on the left and the extreme soft would be on the right. And for comparison, the US is going to be just left of center for that. And then also you have persuading, or the principles first and applications first. So with the principles first, you start with the facts, statements, or opinions versus beginning with theories or complex concepts before presenting facts, statements, and opinions. So on the left, for that principles first, you're going to have Italy. So if you work in Italy, you can expect that. You can gauge for it. And if you want the more application first, then you're going to go to the extreme right, and then you're talking about the US. So then, as far as establishing popular cultures, you're going to see large heterogeneous societies that share certain habits, even if there's much diversity. You're talking about styles, use of language, greeting rituals, foods, and working different places around the world. You'll see greeting rituals that are different than what you're accustomed to here in the US. You're also going to have, just from the industry perspective, you're going to have slang and terminology, and some of that slang that we used to use back in the day, because I worked on a drilling rig for 16 years and chased it all around the world. And then I've worked for an operator for 13 years. But some of the language we used to use to call equipment would not be correct today. It would be inappropriate language. So as you start looking at these popular cultures also impact the rig environment, because you may have somebody from South Louisiana and me from Kentucky and someone else from North Dakota, and we call one piece of equipment something different. So it's just the popular culture for those different regions, and now you're putting all of that together, on a drilling rig or in a refinery or somewhere like that. Then you have folk culture. You'll see here that this is a naming ceremony for a drilling rig that was getting ready to come out of the shipyard. And so for the maritime industry, that would be folk culture, because that's another layer further down to where you're dividing all of these cultures up from your popular culture, your dominant culture, and your national culture. And again, it's cultural traditions practiced at a local level based on longstanding cultural practices. You're talking about community life, ethnic and immigrant traditions, crafts, and music. And again, working in either a multi-region or a multinational society, because oil and gas is truly global, you're going to encounter that. If you go to Brazil, they're going to have the carnival in Brazil, to where similar to New Orleans. to where if you're working in, let's say, North Dakota, you're not going to have that. As far as religious cultures, you may not think that religious cultures have a very big impact on the oil and gas industry. However, when you start getting all of these people from all these different areas of the world, expats and local labor working on locations together, you have no choice but to be impacted by some of their religious beliefs. And some of those religious beliefs would be determinism. It's God determines everything that happens. You know, if it's almost like it's mapped out and predestined. Then you're going to have fatalism, you know, where it's inevitable. It was meant to happen. That also affects the risk tolerance to where you're going to have, let's say somebody's driving a vehicle, they're going to have a lower traffic risk tolerance um, with the higher the fatalism belief is. So the higher the fatalism belief, the lower the risk tolerance, you know, or the more likely they are to believe that it was predestined. And then with superstition, consequences were a result of misdemeanors from your past life. And you can see just in the US, all of the different religious variations and kind of how those are dispersed. And religion goes a lot into impacting culture. So you have to get to know the people that are working for you and know about their families, learn about their cultures, religious beliefs, languages, things of that nature. Because it's imperative to make your operation run smoothly to actually understand the cultures that you're working with. And I found it very interesting working international because I did get to learn about those cultures. So then, as far as a leadership style, you've got egalitarian and hierarchical, and the reason I pick those is because they're so different. You got the distance between boss and subordinate is low on the egalitarian compared to the hierarchical, which the distance between the boss and subordinate's high. That being, you've got the boss, and then the subordinate or the workers are really close to the boss, and they actually will provide feedback. And the egalitarian versus the hierarchical, to where whoever the boss is and whoever the subordinates are working for the boss, there's, I'm not going to say intimidation, but there's not very much interaction. So when you start working in those environments, you're talking about Denmark would be to the far left as far as the boss and subordinates working closely together, and Japan and Nigeria being two countries to where the boss reigns supreme and the subordinates don't really interact with the boss that much or provide that much feedback. And the US is going to be somewhere in the middle, a little bit left of center. Then also consensus versus top down when you're in a decision-making mode. And the last presentation talked about some of that. So as far as the decision-making mode, you're talking about unanimous agreement versus decisions made by individuals. So if you're looking for a society or a culture that has unanimous agreement, Japan is going to be that culture. If you're looking for somebody that has a culture of individuals making the decisions, then you're talking about China and Nigeria. And then the US again is going to be somewhere a little bit left of center. As far as subcultures, you could definitely say that a drilling rig would be a subculture. It's a subculture in some regions to a point to where they don't even want the drilling community there because they have, I'm not going to say a bad reputation, but they have a reputation that's not very popular in those regions. So it may be because of ethnic, regional, economic, or social groups that for some reason or another just don't like the oil and gas industry, specifically drilling and completions, because maybe they saw something on the news that was derogatory toward oil and gas. And then they subcultures that exhibit patterns of behavior distinguishing it from others within another culture or society. And with that, again, you're talking about oil and gas, a lot of times they don't come with a very good reputation because they're transient workers. They look at it, they come in and take advantage of the community for their economic gain, and then they leave, rather than employing people that are there that may not have the necessary skill set. And then it's isolated from the main culture, and it provides mutual support. So then going back to the 8 scales, um, we talked about decision making. Now we're going to talk about trust, task-based versus relationship-based. In the US, you have a very task-based relationship, to where relationships are built, they're worked, and then they're dropped as needed, to where you've got other cultures that take a very long time to actually build relationships. Saudi Arabia is one of those areas, and Nigeria is another area. Having worked in Nigeria for 8 years, I have a lot of Nigerian friends that to this day, because of taking the time to build those relationships, we still have a very strong friendship. And some of the individuals have moved to the US, some are in Canada, some are still in Nigeria, some have moved to South Africa. However, we still maintain those close connections and communicate, because technology makes that possible now. And then as far as the other two, and then I'll finish with the 8 scales. You have disagreement. Confrontation in the oil and gas industry is inevitable. So you've got confrontation and avoids confrontation. So as far as the disagreement and debate are positive for the team versus disagreement and debate are negative for the team, if you look for Israel and France, they would be ones that I'm not going to say are like to argue, but it's the disagreement and debate are positive for their teams. That's how they make decisions. And then Japan and Indonesia are 2 countries that disagreement and debate are negative for the teams. It doesn't have that team cohesion when they start arguing and disagreeing. And then the US again is going to be somewhere left of center. And then scheduling linear time versus flexible time. Linear time is you do everything in specific steps, and you don't take any time away to do anything else. Everything's very methodical. You don't like to be interrupted. And flexible time is you don't mind being interrupted, and it gets done when it gets done. So as far as the linear time culture, you're talking about Germany and Switzerland. And as far as the flexible time culture, Saudi Arabia and Nigeria. And then the US again is a little bit left of center. So it depends, because the US is known as a melting pot of cultures. So again, it's a little bit left of center. You got both. You can go both ways. And I know myself, depending on what the task is I can go both ways. So as far as the oil and gas industry, and I'm getting ready to start closing out here in just a minute. As far as the oil and gas industry itself, you have the operator, which has an internal social structure, and it doesn't really invite a lot of outsiders in. A lot of that has to do with concerns of protesters or people that don't really like the industry. Then you've got, as the last presentation spoke about, that drill site manager that's on location. He's an authoritarian, and the oil and gas industry also has their own language. And I held the inauthority for a second because I want to compare it to an authority and help bolster the last presentation. And then service providers or service companies, a lot of those, they have their own social structure as well. It's often internal. And it's almost like the internal social structures provide a us against them environment. And then they're considered the subordinates. A lot of those are transient workers. And then they also have their own language. And I'm not talking languages in English, Spanish. I'm talking languages in the industry language. It's language for their specific piece of equipment. Because a lot of times these service providers are providing a skill set that the drill site manager may not have, or the drill crew may not have. And I'm speaking in terms of drilling because, again, I have an extremely strong drilling background. So then you also go to in authority and an authority, which goes back to the last presentation. You have a drill site manager that's in authority on that location. Let's say you have a mud engineer that's an authority on that location. He's an authority in mud properties. So he comes up with a good recipe. Well, this drill site manager that is not a subject matter expert can oftentimes override what the person that is an expert says, and develops their own plan, for a lack of better words. So it's important to know all of these cultures and how to get all of these cultures melded together, so that they can actually provide a good operation at the end of the day, and also bolster the safety. So knowing your people and having a military background as well, knowing your people is important. Every location I ever worked on, I knew, not necessarily on a personal sit down and eat dinner with them level, um, because there's so many people you don't get invited to their houses, but I knew about their families. I knew what they like to do. I knew about their religions. I felt compelled to do that because yesterday there was a word that come out that isn't used very much in the oil and gas industry, and that's love. Um, Depending on the cultures and depending on the individuals, I'd actually hug my hands and actually told them I loved them. You know, I cared for them like I did my own family. So that's important. And I'm not telling you to go out there and start hugging people, and because that can create an HR issue. Um, but know your people and know the different cultural variables, so that then at the end of the day, you do legitimately care about them. You know something about them, and it raises your cultural awareness. So how do you get cultural integration? What I was just talking about, mapping all the other culture territories. Know where everybody stands, and then encouraging cross-functional teams and mixing. And when you do this, I would highly encourage, and this is based on research and experience, um, when you start mixing cultural teams together, it's like cross-functional teams. Cross-functional teams, you may have um, one engineer that specializes in chemistry, one that specializes in physics, one that specializes in mechanics, and you put them together in a room and they can get something accomplished. If you get heavily weighted on one side or the other, then they have a tendency where they can take over. It's the same thing when you start mixing cultures together. You want to try to balance the cultures in the room so that you have uh, equal representation. So then the message isn't overweight or taken over by a specific culture, and they don't intimidate somebody else. And then encourage social cohesion, and that's what I'm talking about. Is you get everybody together and you have them talk to each other with just open understanding. You're not looking for confrontation. You're just seeking to understand. And then integration through education. One company I worked for, and that was the drilling contractor that I worked for 16 years, before they would send us into a new area, we would have to go through cultural awareness training, because in some cultures, pointing is disrespectful. Using your finger to ask somebody to come to you is disrespectful in other cultures. Patting a child on the head in cultures is disrespectful. So just that cultural awareness, so then you don't go in and literally mess up just getting started, and that can be detrimental to yourself, the organization, and the operation. And then having effective communication. And I use what's called reflective listening, because when I would give somebody a job task and they would look at you, and a lot of times they'd smile and shake their head, they understood, but I didn't know, because of that I have 500,000 words available. They may have the 70,000 words available. And we have all of these cultural differences, and English is a second language. You know, there's some challenges there. So you ask them that question, can you explain to me what I just told you? So that then it's no disrespect, it's just from a cultural and a language standpoint, do they understand? Any questions?
Thank you, Jerry. That was a fantastic presentation today on culture. Looks like we are going to be running right up against our break time at 1:45. There is one question in the Q&A session, if you don't mind going into that and answering it. Would you mind unsharing your screen for me?
Sure.
We certainly appreciate your time today to talk to us about culture. I know it's something
Yeah, you should have it back.
Yes, sir. I have it. Jerry's contact information is on the screen. If anyone has any additional questions, you can reach out there. And then again, there is one more question in the Q&A session. This will move us to our second break of the day. We'll be reconvening in 10 minutes this time at 2:55 Eastern. This is going to be a little bit shorter break than what we've typically had, so that we can accommodate an additional 5 minutes for one of the presentations later today. So again, we will reconvene at 2:55 p.m. Thank you so much.
Okay, everybody, it is 2:55 Eastern Time, so we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome back. I'm Jeff Atterbury, Senior Policy Advisor in Upstream with API and Manager of the Onshore Safety Alliance. It's my pleasure to moderate the final session and close out this year's summit. This session has three presentations. First, we'll hear from Brent Sutton and Jeff Leith about the 4Ds of HOP, followed by Andrea Baker in a pre-recorded video on accountability in HOP. And we'll end the day with Marco Frate and Valerie Segura on Chevron's HOP journey. Kicking off this session are Mr. Brent Sutton and Mr. Jeff Leith of Learning Teams, Inc., North America. Brent is well regarded as a safety coach and is a co-author of the best-selling books on learning teams, learning from everyday work, the 4Ds for HOP and learning teams, and the HOP Beginner's Guide to Doing Safety Differently. He is the host of the podcast show, The Practice of Learning Teams, and resides in Auckland, New Zealand. Jeff is a well-regarded innovator in workplace safety leadership and is a co-author of the best-selling book on learning from everyday work, The 4Ds for HOP and Learning Teams, and is the owner of the website www.safetydifferently.com. Jeff resides in North Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. They will be presenting the value of learning from normal everyday work with the 4Ds: dumb, dangerous, difficult, and different. Folks, Brent, Jeff, I'll turn it over to you.
Good morning, and thanks, Jeff, for that. Sadly, Jeff Leith can't join us today. Jeff's unwell, but I'm beaming into you live from Auckland, New Zealand. And good afternoon to everyone over there. Obviously, it's very morning here, and we're now moving into our winter period. And if I did a quick calculation, we're probably about twice as warm as North America right now. So it gives you some insight to how tough our winters are. So I'm just going to share my screen for everyone. So what I'd like to do today is just have a really good conversation about the value in learning from everyday work. And, you know, we try our best to set our people up to be successful every day. But sometimes when things don't go as expected, both from an organizational point of view or from a worker's perspective, we learn and we discover these things called causal factors or contributing factors. And in hindsight, it becomes obvious to us why things went wrong. My question to you, if it's so obvious to understand and to see why it went wrong, why is it so difficult to see those things that are emerging or changing that allowed it to go wrong? Because if we're so good in hindsight, why are we so poor in foresight? And this notion of understanding those changing conditions is very much the work of an individual called Eric Hohnagel. And Eric talks about this notion of weak signals, that weak signals live in everyday work. And when a near miss happens or a near hit, those signals become a bit more amplified. And when an event happens, such as an accident, then those weak signals become very strong. And it's because those signals become so obvious to us that it then drives us very much in that hindsight type category. But the trick here is, how do we see those weak signals? And the problem that we're faced with is those weak signals are there all the time, and those weak signals get lost in the noise of everyday work. So that's been part of our passion here at Learning Teams, Inc., is to using the HOP lens, the human organizational performance lens, is about how to develop mechanisms of being able to see those weak signals. From our point of view, we think the most important thing is that the people that face the risk, the people that do the work, they're the ones that have the best knowledge and understanding of the work, and they're the ones that can provide the best insights to us. And that's where we get introduced to the 4Ds. So what are the 4Ds? They stand for dumb, dangerous, difficult, and different. Let's explore some of those things, because it's really important for us to know that when we are asking workers to share their stories, think of this as a storytelling narrative. When we use the word dumb, we're not referring to people. We're referring to the system. We're referring to the conditions in work that don't make sense to them. If this was in the UK, they might call that daft. If this was in Australia, good old the Australians, they'd call this dodgy. So dumb is all about that sense-making component. The heritage of the 4Ds came out of the Air Force with the US Navy. And they had a program called the 3Ds, which stood for dumb, dangerous, and difficult. And they were using this program as a mechanism of an after-action review. So for the ability for people that were performing an operation, that at the either at the beginning of the operation or at the end of the operation, they could come together and explore the things that were dumb, dangerous, or difficult. Our view was that what we want workers to do is we want workers to share with us the rubs and the frictions that happen in everyday work, because work is never going to be perfect. So from that point of view, what we wanted to share is that we want to know when things in the work they do every day is dumb, doesn't make sense to them, when the things they do in their work doesn't feel right, you might call that dangerous. So we might say it doesn't feel right. It might be a gut feel, or they might find as being quite challenging for them to complete. The difficult side, that's where we want to explore things that are harder than they should be, or more demanding than they should be, because we're also using this to understand that psychosocial lens. And different is about dealing with change. So stuff that is different from what we'd normally to expect. And the 4Ds works very much as a storytelling narrative. Why is that important? Well, I think our previous speaker summed it up quite nicely. We're dealing with a lot of different cultures out there. And we can spend our time trying to understand all the different layers of that culture and what we call the codependencies or the interdependencies that might exist. But at the end of the day, what we're trying to achieve is we're trying to get those frontline work groups to communicate about their work, about the challenges they face in that work, about the sense making of that work, and the change in that work, so that the organization can start to understand when those weak signals start to come together. Because here's the shocker. When things do go wrong, we find that those things had existed for quite some time. And that's what investigations do, because we get into that tunnel. So why are the frontline workers so important? Well, if we go back to this whole notion that HOP talks about, and things like safety differently or safety 2, in the world of HOP, we call it black line, blue line. Blue line is workers imagined or workers plan. That is how the organization expects work to occur. And the blue line is how workers are actually having to adapt or create change to be able to perform the work. In some fields of safety, they might see this variation or adaptation as a deviation, shifting away from something. For those that believe that, I would always point you to the work of Edward Deming around lean and quality, the father of lean and quality, where even in the quality circles, they basically talk about that when work is being performed, we need to allow the adaptability or the variability of work to actually happen. We just don't want that variability or adaptability to actually have an impact on quality. I would challenge you for the same thing. Workers need to adapt. There needs to be some variability in that work. We just don't want that work to actually end up creating an event. And in HOP circles, we talk about the fact that workers are the masters of the blue line. In other words, the workers, they have the best knowledge and understanding around the complexity of work. And they're the ones that have the best ability to make sense of that change in that work. So what does this mean? What we have seen is that the better insights the organization can achieve, the better outcomes it basically drives. But those outcomes aren't purely driven around safety. And in fact, the majority of the value or the benefit that organizations are deriving from the 4Ds is actually identifying a lot of the waste or clutter in the system. It's identifying those non-valued activities, those things that actually get in the way, or the things that consume lots of time. Some of the best HOP implementations, organizations in their 15th, 20th year of HOP, they see HOP as driving operational improvement. They see HOP as driving operational excellence. And our view is that if we can get better insights, that can drive better work, and then better work can drive better outcomes. Because every day, your front line are having to balance between work and the risk they are performing. So it's a balance because work equals risk. It's difficult for me to have ever seen any work that is risk-free. They're trying to balance that. And at the same point, they're having to deal with that potential uncertainty that exists in work. And if I explored the uncertainty at the moment, a lot of what organizations do, because they can't manage either the energy from being released, or they're not able to manage the energy in terms of how they might respond to it, where organizations can't manage those risks, or where there's residual risk, we basically end up putting in rules. And we call those things life-saving or cardinal rules. But in reality, that uncertainty that the organization is not able to manage, it's basically transferring it to the front line. And when you're transferring it to the front line, you're effectively swapping risk for dollars. And part of the 4Ds approach is to gain insights, not only to that balance of the work and the risk that workers face, but also beginning to understand about some of that uncertainty component and what they're dealing with. Why is that important? Because traditionally, on the right side, organizations have responded to outcomes. And when they do that response, what they then see are the symptoms or the behaviors. From a systems point of view, we may well have identified things like contributors, causes, all those types of things. But from a human perspective, we'll see those things as being symptoms or behaviors. What we need to understand is that symptoms or behaviors get driven by the conditions, the things that exist in the system at the time. So an example could be there, you might be asking a team to perform a job. The job has been designed that it requires a team of 5 using these particular types of tool. On the day, they're low on resource. The tool they normally use is going to break. We empower our workers to tell them they can stop unsafe work, but we also counter that by saying we need to turn this job around by a certain time. You're basically giving that to the worker for them to determine about that balancing of work and risk. Yet the system has created those conditions where they're having to adapt and change. So the 4Ds is all about giving us insights into those conditions. If we can understand those conditions in work, that then allows us to actually go back and create that change from a system or from a work design perspective. And if we get those conditions right, and we're not saying that work has to be free of any of these types of conditions, because that's just not going to happen. What we're looking for is we're looking to understand when those weak signals start to start to cluster into those strong signals, because it's those signals that matter. That's when it's telling us that that variability of work is shifting away. And if we go back to the black line, blue line, down the bottom, you see that red line. And that red line is how the hazard is performing. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to make sure that the red line isn't coming up and the blue line isn't coming down. Because when those two lines intersect, that is when the event happens. So the 4Ds allows us to get those insights. Some people would say to me, well, isn't that what reporting does? Isn't that why we encourage people to actually tell us about near misses? Isn't that the stuff that we do when we perform toolbox meetings or after action reviews? If you look hard, particularly around those after action reviews, around those toolboxes, a lot of those things are focused around the performance of the individual or the performance of the team. They're very much focused around how the work is being performed itself, not what are the conditions in the system of the work at that time. When it comes to reporting, we need to explore this issue about the difference between empowering people to report versus giving them the autonomy where they feel that they're able to raise an issue. There's been some really good recent science, and the paper was called Fix and Forget. And the paper explored this notion that in industries where problem solving, the ability for workers at the front line to be able to solve problems on the fly, particularly what we call in dynamic risk, that problem solving becomes a really critical skill that those workers have to perform to be successful in every day. And when you get into that problem solving mode, for you to be able to report something means that you've had to acknowledge that you aren't able to solve it. And even if you do report it, if you're not involved in the solution, or if you're not involved in a feedback loop, you are far less likely to ever report again. I would put to you that oil and gas is very much in that problem solving mode. And it's that skill that that frontline have is really the glue between the system at the moment and successful work. Without that problem solving, you wouldn't be able to achieve a lot of the operations that's actually happening. So the 4Ds is very much tuned in to understand what that looks like. So the 4Ds gives us those great insights into operational learning. And those insights also let us know about the risks. And these days, a lot of our focus has been around physical risks or around chronic harm. So that harm to the person being acute and chronic harm to health. COVID has really brought back into focus the issues around psychosocial harm. So that mental harm component. And what we've seen is that the 4Ds really provides us strong insights into that work, particularly around those task factors that exist in work and how those task factors actually have the ability to influence us around that mental health or that psychosocial harm. If I was to explore that further, that at the moment, we very much manage risk, particularly in that physical world. We manage that risk through control and through rules. And when we can't control energy or mitigate energy or defend against energy, we end up putting rules in. But if we can't control, at the other end of the scale, there's an element of caring. And if we can't apply rules at that other element, the other end of rules is actually support. And if I was to overlay the different types of harms that exist, what we see is that a lot of the work we do around that physical harm, that chronic harm, is very much in that controls and rules component. But the psychosocial harm very much exists in that support and caring component. And our comment to you is that if your organization is dealing with critical risks or stickies, as we call them in HOP, stuff that can kill you, that we need to think about what does controlling that energy, and what does supporting workers to be successful in everyday work actually look like. Because in critical risks or dynamic risks, and I'll just share with you, dynamic risks, they are risks that are well known, where the controls are well known, but the hazardous situations that become present are constantly changing throughout the workday or the work shift. So the critical risks are those things that are life-changing to a person. Dynamic risks are where those hazard situations are constantly changing. So the work that we've been doing in the space, particularly in your field, is how do we use the 4Ds not only to understand what happens in everyday work and to gain more insights from that, but also how does it support us around those critical and dynamic risks? Because at the end of the day, we need to understand those stickies. So the 4Ds gives us two components. One is it allows us to look at the efficacy of your controls, so the ability for the controls to actually work. And just as important, the 4Ds also looks at your critical risk management system. And it really says, is that system fit for purpose? And we call that the fidelity. Does the system have the fidelity? Let's explore that. So with the efficacy of controls, what the 4Ds can show us is it can show us what are the actual safety measures? What are those controls, mitigations, or defenses that are present with workers imagined or workers plan? So that's what the organization expects. And what organizational safety measures are then present, missing, or not used with normal everyday work? Then what actual or informal safety measures do workers actually rely on? And we call those things worker defenses to do normal work. So it's not unsurprising that workers also create their own little informal systems to support them to be successful. Sadly, when it goes wrong, you will see those informal systems as deviations, as variations. But those informal systems have been created for a reason, and that's because the system itself hasn't been able to support them. The 4Ds also shows us what are the barriers or the conflicts or the rubs that arise from the present or the use of those safety measures. So when does that control work? When doesn't it work? How does it frustrate it? How does it get in the way of completing that task? And most importantly, when we are relying on those cardinal or life-saving rules that are endemic across this industry, are those cardinal or life-saving rules doable, accessible, usable, and credible? And the work that we've been doing, particularly with one client, and for those that will be going to Banff next month, you'll hear from Josh Bryant. He's the GM of safety and risk for a drilling-based company. When they applied the 4Ds, they have not been able to get the efficacy of their critical controls more than 96%. So those controls are present 96% of the time. So you could either take the positive side, 96, or you could take the deficit side and say 4% of the time they're not present. Before the 4Ds, all the observations, all the audits by them, the audits by contract principals or by third parties, told them that their controls were present and working 100% of the time. How did that shift between those traditional audits and observations versus the 4Ds? And that's the question, and that's what Josh will talk about at Banff. But the slide I've just presented to you will give you some great insights to why that 100% never existed. Now, the challenge we're asked with is 100% achievable. Sadly, what we don't want to end up doing is lowering our threshold for those critical controls, because the organization might say those controls have to be present 100% of the time. So what do we end up doing? We start to drop out, or we start to reprioritize what we think are critical controls to be able to make the 100%. No one will thank you for that when it all goes wrong. And then the other part of the 4Ds is looking at the actual critical risk management standard itself, so the fidelity of the system itself. And the question we're asking there, does that system have both the ability and the capacity to listen to what's actually happening at the front line? Listening is one of the biggest challenges that organizations face around these types of risks. Organizations are really good at telling. They find it really difficult to listen. The second component is, does the system have the ability, and the capacity to identify those weak signals or those small changes that happen in a system? So once again, when it goes wrong, that small change is seen as a big change. But that change didn't happen in one big way. That change happened, or that thing changed in small increments over time. And then the last part is, does the system have the ability and the capacity to learn and improve when those controls are eroding? And it's a really interesting question that we have, because there's this belief out there that if it's a critical control, it must be bulletproof. All the data we are seeing in high-risk industries, controls are eroding. How something was designed and how something is used changes over time. The 4Ds is what really helps us to provide those insights in that area. So, how do you guys access it? How do you use it? Here's the good thing. At Learning Teams Inc., we believe in providing tools to grow the community and to assist organizations to actually create better outcome and better work. The 4Ds is provided at no cost for organizations to actually use. The conditions of our copyright is around attribution, around derivatives, and around non-commercial use. In other words, third parties aren't able to sell or profit from using the 4Ds. But we want the 4Ds to be something that the organizations out there that are dealing with the uncertainty of risk or are concerned about the reliability of systems or their work, to be able to use these types of tools. And that's what we're really trying to drive. And the thing about the 4Ds is the 4Ds will give you some great insights. And for those of you that already are into HOP and particularly using learning teams, the 4Ds is a great way of capturing those problem statements. What I love about the 4Ds, it doesn't matter where you come from, who you are, what your cultural beliefs are. Everyone loves telling a great story. The thing about the 4Ds, it's not about filling in a box. What you might see as dumb, another person might see as dangerous, another person might see as difficult, another person is being seen as different. Those different perspectives are all reflective in us as humans, which you might call our personality types. For those of you that use the eColors product from Rob Fisher at Fisher Technologies, 4Ds They promote the use of 4Ds for that because it recognizes that we're all different, and it recognizes that all of us have different appetite or tolerance for risk. That's the 4Ds. I'd welcome any questions or feedback from the audience. Of course, there's a QR code there on the screen, but that'll be in the slide pack that'll be distributed. Back to you, Jeff.
Yeah, thank you, Brent. And unfortunately, we are at 25 past the top of the hour. So unfortunately, no time for questions, but I did have one. Thank you for your presentation. I do appreciate it. Again, if there are any questions, please email Brent. His email address should be up on the screen right now. It's brents@learningteamsinc.com. Thank you again, Brent. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Jeff. Have a good rest of the day. Thank you.
Next up, I'd like to introduce Andrea Baker. She's a former EHS practitioner and a HOP enthusiast. She is the founder of the HOP Mentor, co-founder of the website hophub.org, co-author of Bob's Guide to Operational Learning, and co-host of a HOP podcast with no name. She could not be live with us today, but she's shared a pre-recorded video, which I'll be playing now, called The Elephant in the HOP Room, Tackling Accountability Head On.
Hey, Jeff, this is Bradley. It doesn't appear that sound is coming through. I know we practiced this earlier. I just wanted to double check that a mute is not on your computer somehow or other.
I don't understand why that's happening. I can hear it just fine on my end.
And specifically, what I was hoping.
Is that any better,
Thank you.
Bradley?
Yes, it is. Thank you.
Apologies.
Ideas of HOP fit with the ideas of accountability. Because if you have any sort of background in what HOP is, I'm not sure if you felt the same way I did, but when I started to learn about the concepts, I was really confused about like, what does this actually mean for accountability? Meaning, like, are we preaching anarchy? Or are we saying, you know, everything's a system problem? We don't have any person problems. I was having a hard time figuring out how it all worked together. So I just want to share a bit of what I've pieced together and see if it's helpful for you all. So I'll put up a visual in case the visual is helpful for anyone. As you might have seen in the past at some point, right? These are sort of the basic tenets or principles of HOP, that the idea that people make mistakes, we make mistakes and we make errors. Like, blame doesn't fix any of that. We can wish people are different than they are, but like humanity, there's like a limit to our ability to do something repetitively, right? There's a limit to our ability to always have the right mental model to make the right decision at the right time. So blame's not going to change any of that. Blame makes it so that we end up thinking we have person problems when truthfully we do have system problems. And to be able to see the difference, we know that context drives behavior. So context is really important for us to learn. And this idea of learning and improving is vital, meaning We actually, to create resilience, it's the speed with which we can learn and improve that allows us to do that. And our response as leaders makes the difference, right? It makes or breaks whether we're able to do all of this. I'm guessing that at some point you may have seen these principles or heard of them or heard them talked to. My difficulty was once I saw this, right, you're talking about blame and you're hearing about context drives behavior, you get all of these stories about people like not following process and not following rules. And I just got really stuck on like, okay, but what does that mean about accountability? Like, are we saying like people can do whatever they want? Are we saying that like, I mean, I came from a highly regulated industry. Well, there's really specific rules that we have to follow. If you don't follow them, like the consequences are real. They're not make-believe. They're like real people die, like real operational upset, like big consequences. It took me about 3 years of exploring these concepts, teaching them in part to make any sense of what accountability is or what it means or how it fits into this subject. And so I would like to pass on the little bit that I've learned to see if it's helpful. To do that, I want to tell you a story about me trying to figure out what accountability is like in real life. And we're going to play a bit of Pictionary as we go because you need a visual for this, but I'm not the best artist in the world. So I'll let you guess what I'm drawing at this point. I mean, people have said maybe chairs, maybe refrigerators, you take your own guess. I'll let you think about what it looks like now. If you're thinking toilets, by the way, you're not alone. A lot of people think it looks like toilets. And we sort of doubled down on that being a possibility by adding a person to the mix. But what I'm trying to draw here is actually two very large buildings. Scale is a bit of an issue, obviously. Two very large buildings. In my world, those buildings are called test cells. So where I came from, we were building, assembling, and then testing jet engines. And so these are test cells that actually allow you, after you put together a jet engine, it allows you to hook it up to high temperature and high pressure equipment in order to make sure that the engine is functioning. So the thing that looks like perhaps the toilet bowl is supposed to represent an engine. And the people that run the test, those folks are in a control room away from the test. Specifically because if something goes wrong, like people make mistakes, right? So if we made an assembly mistake and you hook this thing up to high temperature, high pressure equipment, it could blow up, it could catch on fire. Like you need the people to be separate from the test to protect them. So just good PSM design. The control room is away from where the test is happening, actually above it. And as long as you're in that control room and you're not in the test, like standing next to the engine, you're fine. Now, the proper way to get from test cell 1, just imagine that's the one on the left-hand side, to test cell 2 is to walk out a door, down a set of stairs, around the outside of the building, up a set of stairs, and back in. But there happened to be a room spanning these two test cells that held all of the high temperature and high pressure equipment needed to run the test. And there happens to be a door on either side, one for test cell 1 and one for test cell 2, just for ease of access of the maintenance team. Now on these doors, right, picture a full-size door, there was a sign, with a yellow sign. I don't know if you know this, but yellow fixes everything in safety, right? So a really large yellow sign about half the size of the door that said, "Do not enter while test cell is running, could result in death." Now, the reason the sign was there is because if you happen to be in that corridor and some of that high temperature, high pressure equipment fails and you're standing next to it, I mean, you could get seriously injured to the point that you might not go home. Now, if the doors are closed and you're in the control room, it's designed to protect you. But that area is not an area that, was designed for you to be in while the tests are running. Now, these test cells, they were designed, built, and put into production while I was there. If you had to guess, how long do you think it took before people started to use that corridor as a pass-through to get from test cell 1 to test cell 2, despite the very large sign that was on the door? I'll let you take a stab at it. I can tell you that I found out about it on day 3 of production. I don't know when it started. It could have started before production, but day 3, I found out about it. And so here's this moment, right? You have people not following a rule, and this rule is critical. Like, it's not a pretend rule. There's serious consequences to it. This is where I would get stuck with accountability, because, I mean, people have to follow the rule. Like, how am I supposed to, what am I supposed to do? Like, as a leader in responding to this, how should I be responding? And I'm going to tell you what I did do, and I'm going to tell you what I wish I did. Right. So what I did do was, before I really understood how to apply the concepts in this HOP space. And not everything I did was terrible, but there were a lot of perhaps like misguided beliefs in what I thought I was trying to fix. So I'm going to describe what I did do. I'm going to describe my thought process at the time. And then I want to tell you what I wish I had done and kind of how we resolved it. But I think the first thing that I wanted to do, right, if you're thinking about how you would respond to this, the first thing that I thought was a good idea, that I wanted to actually, I wanted to lock the doors. I wanted to do more than lock the doors. I wanted to interlock the doors. And I'm not alone in that thought process. I've asked a lot of people in a lot of places kind of what they would do in response to this. And what you see on the screen is kind of the general idea of what people want to do. The bigger the words, the more often people say it. So generally we're thinking, okay, we should lock the doors or interlock the doors. Sometimes people think, well, we should explain the why of the rule. People will say, hey, we should coach, we should observe, correct, discipline. Sometimes people say we need to create a new or safer path. And then a small portion of people say we should ask people why they're using it. I was in camp interlock the doors, meaning I wanted that door to function the same way that your microwave door might function. You open it up and the test shuts down. So I asked for permission to like have an engineer draw up making the design change. What I didn't know is that that ask was actually an enormous request. And so the plant manager was like, I'm sorry, we can't do that. Because what I was asking actually was to change a very specific design feature of a test cell that had already been FAA approved. Meaning that if we're gonna interrupt a test in the middle of an engine test, we have to be able to prove that that doesn't affect the engine, right? It doesn't damage the engine. And to do that, you have to run many series of tests to prove it and then have that test cell recertified by the FAA. That represents many tests and millions of dollars of loss. So the sort of natural response that I got when I asked that was, I'm sorry, Andrea, but no, we're not going to spend millions of dollars because we can't have people follow this simple rule. So then I have to go back to the drawing board, right? What am I going to do now? And my thought was, well, I should start with explaining the why of the rule. And so I created what I thought was like a really nice PowerPoint presentation about the dangers of high temperature and high pressure equipment, explaining why this sign was here and why it was so important. Now here's the question. If I think that my PowerPoint presentation describing the dangers of high temperature and high pressure equipment, if I think that that's a solution, like that's going to fix the problem, what do I have to believe the problem is? Well, I have to believe the problem is that people don't know. That the folks that work with high temperature and high pressure equipment are unaware of the risk associated with it. That's actually a pretty large assumption. And I can tell you, I didn't think that deeply about it. Like, I got that assumption from the mere fact that people were using that corridor. Like, that's as deeply as I thought. There's a sign, people aren't following the sign, they must not understand the sign is for real. Let me go teach them. So picture this, right? I walk into this control room, and these folks, right, many of them have been doing this job for longer at this point than I was alive, right? This is many years ago already. And I think almost all the people that were working there had been doing work in this type of environment for longer than I had been alive. But I walk in anyway with my computer and my presentation, And I walked through the dangers of high temperature and high pressure equipment. And then at the end, we all shake hands. Like, I force them to shake my hand. We shake hands and I say something like, I care about your safety. I know you care about your safety. And so we're going to follow this rule, and it's an important rule. And then I had them all sign a piece of paper that they had been there, and I walked away. I felt honestly pretty good about it, right? I'd done the hearts and minds. I explained the why of the rule. And obviously, I think you probably know, I didn't at the time, but I didn't actually change the behavior of walking through the corridor. That's not what my presentation had done. It had changed something, but it hadn't changed behavior. The thing it changed actually is it changed their perspective and their opinion of me. I had sort of walked into that room with this idea that I knew better and that I could teach them, fill in the gap. And these folks knew that information already. So yeah, kind of maybe thought it was like perhaps cute. I'm not sure exactly how they thought of it, but certainly it didn't raise their opinion of me. As you can guess, it didn't really change the behavior. So I had to go back to the drawing board again. And so I went back to the leadership team and I said, hey, I did the hearts and minds. I did the training. People understand why the rule's in place, but they're still not following it. What do you want me to do? And the thought at the time was, well, we need to have them understand that we're serious about the rule, right? We need to hold them accountable. And so what we're going to do is disciplinary action, like myself and the supervisor. And we'll do progressive discipline, which in my world started with a coaching conversation, and then a verbal warning, and then a written verbal, and then a written, et cetera, et cetera. And so we started to do that. And I got really good at like the demeaning coaching conversation, by the way. So I got really good at that. I care about your safety. I know you care about your safety. We already had this conversation. We signed a piece of paper. This rule is non-negotiable. I need you to understand that it's important. I don't want to see this again, right? I got pretty good at that conversation. I don't know exactly what I thought I was fixing with it. I mean, I guess I thought I was modifying behavior. Modifying behavior, I guess, through fear, right? Fear of losing your job or fear of being pointed out as somebody not following rules. All I knew that it was pretty normal, right? Where I came from is this is how we would handle the situation. And I got to one written warning for one of the people, just one of the folks that worked. And from then on, I didn't see anyone use it as a pass-through. So I was feeling pretty good about myself, right? Pat on the back, I've changed it, behavior modification, people get it, they understand we're serious, feeling good. And I did an audit every week, like for this, and it was a different time every week, right? I wanted to make sure, like I want to see what's really happening, so I'd come at a different time. And for about 2 months of doing my audits, I didn't see anything. I'm feeling good. And then one day I almost forgot to do my audit for that week, right? I was busy. And now my audit is also a metric requirement, so I have to do it. I don't want to get in trouble for not doing it. So I convinced myself that I could have the new intern do it for me. Like I convinced the intern, it'll be good for you. You'll get to know the site. So I hand my audit over to the new intern. And what I noticed is when he came back, within a 15-minute period of time, he had seen 3 people use that as a pass-through. That was the first thing that I noticed on his audit sheet. And I realized that while I had thought I had modified behavior, that people weren't using it as a pass-through, I hadn't. I had modified behavior very differently. I had modified behavior in a way that people were just hiding what they were doing from me. That's called having a compliance mentality. And in a compliance mentality, what that means is that you show up a certain way, you act a certain way in front of some authority figure, right? Somebody who's going to tell you to do it differently or write you up for it. But as soon as that person walks away, you go back to doing what you thought was right to begin with. Like an example of this in our personal life is when you slow down, when you see a police officer while you're driving, and then as soon as they're out of view, or as soon as you don't have the threat of getting a ticket anymore, you speed back up again. And I had inadvertently done that in my own facility. compliance mentalities are actually some of the most dangerous places that we can live in. Because realistically, in an organizational structure, right, the people that have the decision rights and resourcing to make like a system level change to something is usually the leadership team that the behavior is being hidden from. So I have some amount of authority, some amount of influence to change something, to change a design, right, to request an engineering change, but I didn't even know there was a problem anymore, right? I thought it was fixed. It was all hidden from me. And I didn't know how they were doing it, by the way, because I showed up at different times. Like, how are they hiding their behavior? They told me later. Actually, it turns out that it took me about 15 minutes to get across the plant to get to this place, and they could see me coming, right? So they had a 15-minute warning every time that I was going over there. To be perfectly honest with you, I was very embarrassed when I realized that people had just been hiding things from me. I was angry and I was embarrassed. And I went back to the leadership team and I told them that, hey, we've done this progressive discipline and it's not working. And I don't know what to do next. Like, do we just fire somebody? Or like, I just really wanted to lock the doors, right? I was still set on my original, like, just let me lock the doors. It'll be safer for everyone. And so instead of asking for interlocks this time, I just said, could I just put a regular, like a locking key, like a different doorknob on it? Like, does that require FAA approval, or could we just change the doorknob? And I got approval to do that. And it was like put in place, like our maintenance team did it. And I went to go check on the doors after they had been changed out. So I went to go look at it, and sure enough, lock on the handle, great. And I'm about to walk away, and I notice there's a key over the door ledge. So I put the key in my pocket. Maintenance is the only people that have to get in here, right? So they're the only ones that need the key. So I put the key in my pocket, but I came back later that day to try to figure out what happens when you take the key away. And I came back expecting another key up there. There wasn't. And the door, I checked it, it was locked. I'm about to walk away, and I pulled on the door, and it pulled open. It pulled open because they had put tape on the door to prevent it from locking. So now I'm angry, right? So now I'm really angry, and I would do this differently if I could, but I'm really grateful that I kind of made this mistake, because I walked into that control room, and I looked at the people that were working there, and honestly, this was out of sheer frustration that I asked this next question. It's a question that I should have asked from the beginning, but in real life, I asked it out of frustration. And I just said this, would somebody please tell me why we keep using this as a pass-through? You could die. Now, for any of you who've worked in this hop space before, you know that we work very hard to create psychological safety or conditions for candor, or the ease of people telling us the truth. And yelling at somebody is not a good way of doing that. But I wasn't trying to create conditions of candor at that moment. I just was frustrated. And I got really, really lucky that one of the people that worked in that area, he'd been there for 30 years, and he didn't need me to create a psychologically safe environment. If I was willing to ask the question, he was willing to answer it. And what he said, looked me in the eye and he said, Andy, it's because your rule is stupid. And I, thankfully, at that moment in time, rather than losing it, I said, tell me more. And this is what he told me. He said, Andy, what you probably don't know is we don't use this corridor while the engine is at full throttle. We only use it while the engine is idling. For translation, that means everything is at lower temperature, lower pressure. It's a bit of a risk assessment done. But the difficulty is even at low temperature, low pressure, even while the engine is idling, it's still fairly dangerous, right? You could still get injured. And so that's what I said. I told him that. It's like, I appreciate it, but you still can't use it as a pass-through. And he said, well, then you've probably forgotten, Andy, that part of the quality checks we have to do on this engine, we have to go into the test cell and stand next to an idling engine with the same temperature and pressure equipment you're so concerned about in this corridor, but don't seem very concerned about in the test? Or did you not know that? And then he said, and perhaps you forgot this, Andy, but while you guys were all designing this thing, we asked you to put cameras into the test cells so that we didn't have to go in. But you all told us it was too expensive. Or did you forget that too? And then he said, and perhaps you forgot this, Andy, but we used to have 2 groups of people to run 2 test cells. When you guys put the new one in, you all decided the technology was good enough that you only needed 1 group of people. But you were wrong. And you didn't give us a fast enough way to get from test cell 1 to test cell 2 to run both of them at the same time. Or did you not know that either? So that was one of the times that I've been offered an enormous slice of humble pie. Because I have to tell you that the problems that I thought we were dealing with, right? I thought we were dealing with people who didn't care, didn't know the rules. People who were just being purposely disobedient and needed some amount of fear to behavior modify. And then when none of that worked, I just decided, well, we're going to lock the doors. And I hate to admit how we talked, but we said things like, if they're going to act like children, treat them like children, lock the doors. But that wasn't the real problems. The real problems were true operational struggles. The fact that they actually had to stand next to the engine idling already. So we were willing to accept that as a risk. I mean, we labeled it as part of the process, right? So it felt like just a necessary risk. And then as a leadership team, we labeled going through this corridor as an extra risk that you didn't have to take. Well, that's not what it feels like to the end user. So you mean you want me to stand here to do this part of my test for a significant period of time, but you're telling me in the same conditions, I can't use this corridor for maybe 2 seconds to get from one side to the other. And oh, also, by the way, I have to get to the other side if you want these things to keep running. And the other way is not fast enough. If I could do this all over again, I would have started off by learning, by just humbly asking people. I saw something that didn't make sense to me, people not following a sign, but honestly, I didn't ask. I didn't ask them why. I went through all of this other stuff first, trying to create this accountability. And honestly, it was because I was subject to something called Taylorism. The Taylorism, if you haven't heard of it, it's an ism like ageism, like racism, like sexism. I mean, that's the slang term, how it's used. If you Google it, what you'll find is actually it refers to the principles of scientific management, which is a paper written by Frederick Winslow Taylor. He wrote it in 1911, I think. And it was an attempt to help sort out how you mass produce things, right? Because at the time, going through the Industrial Revolution, the mental model people had was just of a master craftsman making small batches. The idea of how to mass produce something efficiently, it was confusing to people. And we hadn't done it before. And his paper seemed to offer answers. It's actually considered the most influential paper for the entire century in business. And it's still taught in business school today. One of the things that he suggests, like, is that you don't try to create a bunch of master craftsmen. Actually, you instead, you teach somebody how to do a small portion of something and pass it on to somebody else who knows how to do another small portion of it. Kind of the beginning of what an assembly line looks like is one of the ideas that he wrote down. So all that's really helpful. But in addition to that information, he made his opinion of the worker very apparent, and it wasn't a very nice opinion. He had a very low opinion of the people that were coming to work. He said things like, the worker does not have the mental capacity that the planner has. He said things like, I could teach an intelligent gorilla how to do some of this pig iron work better than he could some of the workers. So the reason it has this slang term, this other ism, is because it's describing an improper belief that the people who plan and manage work are smarter than the people who are executing the work. And if you look at any management timeline, the history of management, Taylorism is the first tick. right? Followed quickly by Fordism. And why that's important for us to know is just because from the beginning of management, you're actually taught to operate in something that resembles a parent-child dynamic, where those of us that plan and manage work have been pushed into the parent ego position, and those that execute the work are often pushed into the child ego position. And whether or not I knew it, that's what had happened to me. I felt like I was in the parent ego position. It was my job to take care of these folks, to educate them, to teach them. Whereas it would be much healthier if I was picturing it as an adult-adult relationship. What that means is that I know some information, and also you know some information, and it's different information. It's based on the nature of our job, but you are a fully functioning adult human whose opinion I should be respecting and understanding and learning. And if you're doing something that I don't understand, I should be asking questions, not telling you what you should do. I should be learning. I didn't know that yet. But this is where my understanding of accountability started to change. Because in my world, we had actually very much mixed up the ideas of accountability, disciplinary action, and consequences. Meaning we would say something like, we need to hold that person accountable, like in this example. And what we really meant is we needed to use HR disciplinary action. Or we'd say the person needs to be disciplined. And what we really meant is that we felt as though they needed some consequence, like some man-made consequence for what they did. I needed a different definition of accountability for it to make sense. And honestly, the definition that seems to work really well, it's nothing fancy. It's I think it's the 2007 Merriam-Webster definition. Because realistically, all we're trying to do here is sort of detangle some of the concepts that we've interwoven. And once they're detangled, it makes a lot more sense as to how we should be responding. Accountability, a great definition for a group of people. It's the willingness to accept responsibility for your actions and to account for it, meaning to tell the story of your actions. Maybe the most important piece of this is it's somebody's willingness to accept responsibility. Meaning you can't force someone to feel that way. In any situation, somebody either feels accountable or they don't. Now, why somebody feels accountable, there's sort of two large buckets that we want to look at. One, we don't have a lot of ability to change, right? One bucket of whether or not somebody can feel accountable is who they are. Meaning, I mean, I don't know any other way to describe this, but I guess whatever you would sit down and unpack with a psychologist or a psychiatrist about how you see the world. Right? Do you see yourself as a victim? Do you feel like you have agency? That absolutely plays a part as to whether or not somebody feels responsible for their actions. But then there's another piece of the puzzle. And that's the environment that we put people in. And what's interesting is the environment itself can eclipse the person's individual feeling of accountability. Meaning I can take a highly accountable individual and put them in a low accountable environment. And it's going to be really hard for them to feel accountable. Because there are environments that lend themselves towards people being able to feel accountable, and there are environments that lend themselves towards people not. And I'll describe it to you, see if this has any meaning for you. A low accountability environment. A low accountability environment is one in which you take any person, they're going to feel, it's going to be hard for them to feel accountable or responsible for their actions. Right? It's what it feels like. If you're an employee, you walk in and you kind of feel like you're a cog in a wheel. You feel like a number. You feel replaceable. You're often in the child's ego position. Somebody else is telling you what to do. Your expertise is not really sought after. Changes are made to you, not with you. It feels like head down, work to plan, follow written instruction. In that environment, it's hard to feel accountable for anyone because you can't take responsibility for your actions if you don't believe your actions are your own to take. You can't feel responsible if you don't feel like you have agency. And you can hear it, right? It's not it's not confusing. You can hear low accountability environments. People say things like, "It's not my job," or hey, I mean, don't look at me, I was just following the procedure. Or, yeah, I mean, I sent you an email on it, you'll find it. Those are all indications that we're in a low accountability environment. Now, in any group of people, you're going to have some folks that are apathetic to their job. Not what I'm talking. Wow. What we're talking about here is when a large group of people talk that way. When that's true, that is a function of the environment that we put people in, not a function of the people that we're hiring. You can also picture literally the exact opposite of that environment. That's a high accountability environment, one which you're not in that child ego position, right? People are curious. Your expertise is sought after. You feel like you have some amount of agency because people are curious about your reality. Like they're asking you questions. They want to know how something affects you. Instead of telling you, just follow this sign, they're interested in why you're not. In that type of environment, things are much different. And actually, the few folks that are super apathetic to their job, those are the ones that stick out like a sore thumb. Now, this doesn't mean we don't use HR disciplinary action, but we use HR disciplinary action when we're dealing with person problems. What I was talking about in my example, I didn't know it at the time, but it was a system problem. It wasn't a person problem. Person problems are actually pretty easy to identify. Right? So person problems, they follow the person around. Right? They're a hiring mistake. You know your person problems. Honestly, we know them by first and last name. It is a very small fraction of the population. They bring the problems with them. But I mean, we use disciplinary action there. I mean, we give somebody a fair chance to change what they're doing before we ask them to leave. But most of what we deal with are system problems. And in system problems, disciplinary action doesn't make any sense. Actually, the only thing we can do is learn what's happening and improve. System problems follow the system around. Meaning I could have replaced that group of folks working in those control rooms with a bunch of other people doing the same job, and it would have made sense to them to use that corridor too. Their actions were not a function of them as a person. Their action was a function of the environment that they were in and what was logical, what had operational fidelity, what made sense at the time. And in order for us to address those problems, we have to label them properly. By the way, I mean, we ended up, you don't leave things broken. We ended up guarding the inside of that corridor so that people could use it as a pass-through. Or you don't just say, don't follow the rules and everything's fine. You have to fix stuff, right? So we did, but the team taught me what to do. They taught me the problems, and then it was their ideas, guarding the inside of the corridor so that you could use it as a way to get to safely get from one side to the other. And then we spent a lot of time looking for cameras that we could use to do what they were trying to do with the naked eye to solve that problem as well. So I guess the message here in the really short amount of time that we have together is that accountability is absolutely something we want and need, right? And HOP doesn't say that there shouldn't be accountability. We want to need it, but disciplinary action doesn't create it. Disciplinary action is a fair way to deal with a person problem. And person problems, we already know who they are. You do, like you could write a list of them right now. The rest of what we're dealing with sometimes feels like a person problem on the surface, like how I felt about the folks using that door. But when you learn, you realize it's not. It's just people are making a logical adaptation because we've got an operational struggle. And until I know what that operational struggle is, I really don't know what to do differently. And certainly the folks that are close to the work have much better ideas than I do. I don't know if this helps. I think the time that we have together, I hope it does. I hope it gives maybe just like a slightly different perspective as to what accountability is. We want and need it. We also want and need disciplinary action. But unfortunately, if we mix them up, meaning if we try to use disciplinary action when we have system problems, like what I did in that story, it doesn't really fix anything, which is generally makes people hide things. And unfortunately, if we do that very often, we end up doing the exact opposite of our intent, meaning we've created that low accountability environment. We created that space where people are forced into that child ego position, which is the exact opposite that we wanted. Thanks for spending some time, and I appreciate you being here with me, and I hope it helps. See you.
All right. Thank you, Andrea. Again, please direct any questions to Andrea via her email that's on the screen. That's hopmentor. For a presentation you are interested in, you can send questions to the presenters directly. Their emails can be found on the Summit's webpage. Videos from those presenters who consented to have their presentations recorded for future viewing will be placed on the webpage for the Center for Health, Work, and Environment, shown at the link on this slide. And finally, just to wrap it up, you'll be asked to fill out an evaluation form after the end of the summit. I believe that link has already been shared. At the end of the evaluation form, there is a place for you to input your name and email. You will need to fill that part out to be sent a certificate of attendance for the summit that can be used to document attendance if needed for certification points. On behalf of the NORA Oil and Gas Extraction Sector Council, thank you for your attendance and participation. We'll see you next year at the 2025 Spring Health and Safety Summit. Thank you again, and goodbye.